Tyranny of Steel. Chapters 306 to 325. Chapter 306 Cat Fight 3. While Berengar was away at war, one man was in Kufstein working exceptionally hard to cover for the king's absence. This man was Chancellor Otto von Gratz. After the debacle with Liudbert, Berengar had selected someone else to act as chancellor. However, this man had utterly failed to live up to the task. Thus, when Berengar promoted his uncle and soon-to-be father-in-law to Marquis, he also gave him the position of chancellor, which in Berengar's kingdom was equivalent to the vice-president. Otto had been working at home in Graz during his tenure as chancellor until now. After all, there was not much work that needed to be done in such a position. Now that Berengar was off at war, it was the chancellor's job to rule in his stead. Thus Otto had traveled to Kufstein with Adela in tow and was currently living within a chateau built within the city. Every day Adela would visit the castle of Kufstein, where she would interact with her rival Lind. She also played with her dear friend and cousin Henrietta, who had just begun to enter into her teenage years. At the moment Adela was in a meeting with Lind, the two young women were having a serious discussion now that they were alone for the first time in a long time. Adela had a calm expression on her face as she began to chastise Lind for her behavior that resulted in another child before Adela herself could marry her fiancé. You couldn't help yourself, could you? You just had to convince Berengar into giving you another child so soon, even though you knew there were still some years before he and I got married. That's selfish of you, you know that, right? I still have months before I can marry my fiancé, and in the meantime, he has given you his lover 2 children. Do you have any idea how envious that makes me? How long will this war last? What if he doesn't come home for a year or 2? If that is the case, then by the time I get married to him, your children will already be 5 and 3. How is that fair to me? In response to this line of questioning, Lind held her head high. She was exceptionally proud of her relationship with Berengar and felt no guilt for her actions. Seeing the smug grin on Linda's exquisite face, Adela sighed in defeat before placing her forehead in the palm of her hand. She sounded exhausted as she admitted defeat. Whatever, that's in the past. What I need to worry about now is Honoria. Just how much have the two of them been sleeping together? Do I need to worry about another bastard child being born before my own? The term bastard greatly pained Lind, however, she kept it to herself. Instead, a wicked smile curved itself upon the angelic beauty's lips as she thought of the question Adela asked. As such, Lind decided to punish the little fiancé for her cruel remarks. This did not go unnoticed by the shrewd girl, who confused Linda's smug expression as a sign that she knew something important. As such, a cold gaze spread across Adela's sapphire blue eyes as she glared at Lind with a stern expression. What aren't you telling me? Lind was aware of how many nights Berengar had spent with Honoria. Since his birthday nearly half a year ago, the man had been demanding that his 2 women share his bed with him at the same time. As such, there was not an intimate moment between Berengar and Honoria that the veteran spymaster was unaware of, at least in recent history. With this in mind, Lind decided to play with Berengar's fiancée, who she thought of as nothing more than a naive little girl. Seeing Adela's reaction to the debauchery that Berengar engaged in with his 2 lovers every night would at the very least be entertaining to the young woman. I wouldn't worry about that if I were you. Berengar hasn't done anything that could get the girl pregnant. This answer confused Adela, as she was still young and innocent and was unaware that 3 people could share a bed, or how one could have sex without the risk of pregnancy. All she knew about procreation was the small details her parents had informed her of, which was nothing more than basic biology. As such, the young fiancé asked the question on her mind in a fit of fury. How could you possibly know that? Upon hearing this, Lind simply smiled before approaching the girl and whispering in her ear the grotesque details about how she and Honoria would service Berengar every night. Before long, Adela's cute face was flushed red with embarrassment. No matter how much Lind said, she could not pull herself away out of curiosity. After Lind had spent a few minutes explaining her usual nightly play with her master, she broke away from the girl with a satisfied expression. The embarrassed and shocked appearance of Adela was too cute, and Lind intended to enjoy every second of it. It took Adela a few moments to find the words to rebuke Lind. At first, she stammered over herself before gradually forming the words to chastise the vixen in front of her. Why, you pervert. You're sick. There's no way Berengar would do such a thing. You have to be lying. However, Lind giggled in response to Adela's innocent reactions. To her, this was the best form of revenge for what the little girl had said about her children earlier. As such, she responded to Adela in an amorous tone. I am sure that after your wedding night, he will pressure you into joining the fun. I can't wait until I see the day, little sister. The moment Adela heard those words, she began to pout and reject Linda's statement. There was no way she could ever conceive of the idea of sleeping with Berengar along with his two lovers. It was simply out of the question. I will never do such a thing, even if Berengar asks it of me. That's just wrong, for so many reasons. How can you possibly live so sinfully? Are you not afraid that God will punish you? To think you would drag Berengar down into such filth with you. This comment only made Lind laugh even more. This statement was just too funny to her. As such, she laughed so hard that she nearly collapsed. After over 30 seconds of laughing, the young woman finally began to calm down and wiped the tears from her eyes. Adela, of course, was furious at this response and had grit her teeth while curling her fists as she struggled to contain her inner wrath when she asked about Linda's outrageous reaction. What's so funny? To this, Lind sighed before informing Adela of the reality. It was not me who suggested such a thing, to begin with. Adela found this shocking. If it was not Lind, it could only be Honoria. However, Adela did not immediately pin the blame on the young princess. Instead, she asked the identity of the pervert who first thought up such wicked behavior. Then who was it? Lind struggled to contain her laughter as she anticipated Adela's expression when she heard this next piece of information. Well, Berengar had joked around about the idea a few times to me, but it was ultimately Honoria who came up with the plan to give him such a birthday gift. I had my reservations at first, but it was quite an enjoyable experience. I am sure you will join us soon enough. After all, I can tell that you are curious no matter how much you protest. After saying that, Lind walked past Adela, tapping her on the shoulder before leaving the room in silence. In doing so, she left Adela alone with nothing but her imagination about such a situation where she, Lind, Honoria, and Berengar all embraced one another. The more Adela thought about it, the more her mind went numb until she finally shook herself out of her stupor. At that moment, the little fiancée made a solemn vow to herself as she cursed Lind beneath her breath. I will never allow such a thing to happen, just you watch, bitch. After saying this, Adela too left the room. However, unlike Lind, who had left in style, Adela had gone out in a tantrum. She could not believe Berengar had fallen to such depravity. As such, she made it her mission to bring Berniger back into the light. Whether she would teach the man she loved the error of his ways or fall to the depravity she resented was yet to be seen. Chapter 307 Excessive Plunder. After having successfully raided the Venetian merchant vessel, Honoria and her crew had begun to set sail for Trieste. Austria did not have much coastline at the moment, and Trieste had formed the central trading hub. It was also the city with the largest harbor, as it held Austria's most significant shipyard. The haul that the crew of Honoria's Revenge had achieved was substantial. Not only did they manage to loot the wealth the merchants had gained from their recent trade with Byzantine merchants, but they also got a hold of the expensive items they were bringing back to Venice. On top of this, they got several prisoners to ransom back to Venice. If Venice refused to pay for their ransom, they would sell them to slavers within Constantinople for profit. Either way, there was money to be made with the captives. At the moment, Honoria was enjoying the beer Berengar had given to her. It was the standard drink prepared on board the vessel. In the middle of her captain's quarters, she was lying on her plushy feather mattress, which was covered with silk sheets. She immensely enjoyed the freedom of the seas, and she could not thank Berengar enough for fulfilling her dreams. The only thing she regretted was that her lover was off at war while she returned to his borders. If not for that, she might stop by Kufstein to engage in some fun with Berengar and Lind. However, Honoria's thoughts did not last long as she overheard a knock on her door. As such, she rose from her bed and walked over to the door. After opening it, she saw that Elfrin was standing at the entrance with an excited expression on her face. Before Honoria could inquire about it, Elfrin blurted out her news. Captain, we have spotted a Genoan vessel. It appears to be a carrack. What are your orders? Hearing that such a large merchant vessel was nearby brought a smile to Honoria's face as she immediately placed her beer upon her cupboard and grabbed a hold of her baldric, which contained her pistols and her sword. After slinging it over her shoulder, Honoria put on the cavalier hat Berengar had given her and smiled before giving her orders. "We're going to pillage it, of course." With this, Elfrun's excitement grew even further as she grabbed a hold of 2 grenades from her belt and rubbed them with anticipation. "I can't wait to use these bad boys." Seeing such a cute expression on the young adolescent girl's face as she talked about violence brought a smile to Honoria's own immaculate visage. As such, she grabbed a hold of the girl and stuffed her into her bosom before exclaiming, "Oh, my sweet little Elfrun, you are just too adorable." Elfrun did not deny the hug and nuzzled against Honoria's chest like a cute little kitten with a smile on her face. After a few moments, Honoria released the girl before dragging her up to the ship's deck as she began to shout her orders to her crew of salty wenches. "Prepare for battle, we are taking this carrack." With that said, the girls on board began to cheer as they loaded their weapons. Before long, the sloop of war that was Honoria's privateering vessel caught up with the Genoan carrack. With this in mind, Honoria immediately gave the order when they had successfully entered the firing range. "Fire at will." The moment Honoria gave this command, the 18-pound-long guns opened fire on the carrack with their solid shot. They did not intend to cripple or blow up this ship. A carrack was a mighty vessel capable of journeying from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, and as such, it was worth a fortune. If they could capture the vessel and repair it, they could sell it to the Byzantines or Granadans for a substantial sum. With this in mind, the cannons fired their solid cannonballs into the enemy vessel. Before the Genoans could even react, they found themselves being blasted apart. After the first volley of 10 cannonballs was propelled at the target, Honoria's crew rapidly began to reload the guns before once more firing the projectiles. With each cannonball, a bit more of the carrack was chipped away, and the Genoan sailors were forced to bilge the rising water within their vessel. This was an issue Honoria's ship did not have due to the watertight seal created from the galvanized steel-plated hull. The carrack was nearly defenseless from the cannon fire forced upon it by Honoria's vessel. After all, it utterly lacked in offensive weapons, aside from a few crossbows utilized by the sailors. The roughly 50 sailors aboard the Genoan vessel fired their crossbows at the enemy, but Honoria and her girls were well protected by the cover the ship's hull provided. As such, the women on board Honoria's Revenge fired their repeating flintlocks at the enemy sailors. The rate of fire, the effective range, and the damage these weapons were capable of was vastly superior to the crossbows used by the Genoan sailors. Before long, half of the Genoan sailors were dead, and they had begun to raise the white flag. After this action was completed, they disarmed themselves, and Honoria's crew lowered the planks, where they quickly boarded the vessel. After doing so, they began to restrain the surviving Genoan sailors. The crew of the carrack was surprised to see that the pirates who attacked them were all women. As such, the captain of the vessel began to bark at the lasses who had attacked his ship. "Which one of you bitches in charge?" The moment he said this, Honoria appeared before him with a cruel smirk on her face. She kicked the man in the gut in response to his statement before informing him of her status. "I am Captain Valeria Zonera, privateer licensed by the Kingdom of Austria to combat the enemies of His Majesty King Berengar. You will show me some respect." The man had just begun to recover from the violent reaction when he spat on the ground before further cursing the woman. "Fucking Austrians. They've now got women doing their dirty work. You fucking barbarians should learn your place." Honoria glared viciously at the captain of the Genoan vessel. These sailors had no respect for women or Berengar's people, and as such, they needed to be taught a lesson. Thus, a devilish idea formed in the princess's mind as she barked her orders. "Elfrun." With this, the little girl immediately jumped up from her spot and saluted Honoria. "Yes, Captain?" A wicked grin formed across Honoria's immaculate visage as she asked Elfrun the question on her mind. "Do you think you have a grenade that can fit in this man's mouth?" Elfrun went from shock to a state of excitement as she matched Honoria's malicious smile before fumbling in her pockets. As she did so, she found a small steel ball filled with explosive powder and a fuse. The moment she pulled out the small explosive device, the little girl leapt with joy as she walked over to the Genoan captain and forced the grenade in his mouth with the fuse sticking out. After doing so, she gazed at Honoria, who nodded at her in response. Upon seeing this, Elfrun lit the fuse with her lighter before backing off from the blast zone. The captain's eyes opened wide as he tried to scream for help, but it was no use. The grenade was lodged between his jaw, and he could not quickly spit it out, nor could his cries for help reach the ears of his compatriots who were bound nearby. Witnessing such a horrific sight, the Genoan sailors began to scream for Honoria to stop. "Mercy! Show him mercy, please!" Luckily the fuse was a slow-lit match. Otherwise, the man's head would have exploded by now. As such, Honoria glanced over at Elfrin before asking the question on her mind. "What do you think? Should we show mercy?" With this, the little girl began to pout. She wanted to see the sight of the man's head explode, purely for scientific reasons, of course. However, after thinking about it, the girl thought it might be a bit too cruel and pulled the grenade out of the man's mouth before tossing it into the sea. After doing so, Elfrin realized that the man had quite literally pissed his pants in fear, and as such, the girl was disgusted before walking back to Honoria's side. It took the Genoan captain a few moments to come back to his senses before he gazed up at Honoria as if she were the devil. As he stared at the foreign beauty, a malicious smile spread across her visage before she leaned in and whispered to him. "Call me a bitch again, and I promise you the next time I will go through with it, do you understand?" The Genoan captain had shivers down his spine as he nodded silently towards the demonic woman in front of him. Afterward, Honoria called out to her crew. "You know the drill, put them in the brig, and plunder the vessel, whatever we can't take leave on the ship, after all, we're sailing this baby to port." With that said, the girls quickly got to work, locking up the prisoners and distributing the goods. Before long, the two ships were sailed side by Honoria's crew on their journey to Trieste. The gains they made on this day were substantial. One thing was sure, Honoria and her crew would be eating well tonight. Chapter 308 The Holy Roman Empire responds. Within the city of Florence, the doges of Venice and Genoa were kneeling before the Holy Roman Emperor. Emperor Balsamo Corsini was beyond livid after the preemptive strike Berengar had engaged in on his two most powerful vassals. The destruction of the majority of the Genoan and Venetian navies was a massive blow to imperial power, not just in the war against Austria but across the Mediterranean as a whole. Besides this, Berengar had openly licensed pirates, or privateers as he referred to them, to attack what little shipping remained of empire. With this in mind, the emperor had called his two subordinates to the current capital of the empire with the intent of seeing how this crisis they were suffering could be salvaged. The Venetian doge was the first to speak his mind. "3/4 of my navy was destroyed in the attack on my harbor, along with well over half of my merchant fleet. The attack has laid waste to the pier itself. As such, Venice can no longer accept trade by sea without a port. If that were not bad enough, our shipyards were annihilated, and our factories have been reduced to rubble. Because of this, we cannot build new ships for God knows how long." The Venetian doge's face was flushed with anger, and his fists were curled as he shouted these words at the emperor. The attack was swift and unexpected. Berengar had purposely sent the Swiss agent without a horse to deliver the news of Austria's independence to the emperor. With the time it took the man to reach Florence, Berengar had engaged in preemptive strikes on Venice and Genoa and amassed an army at the Italian borders. The aftermath of these attacks had severely reduced the empire's ability to fight on the seas. The Genoan doge was not in any better condition. Despite this, unlike his Venetian counterpart, he remained calm and collected as he informed the emperor of Genoa's losses. "We are in a similar situation. 80% of our armada now lies at the bottom of the Ligurian Sea, our harbor is non-existent, and our ability to manufacture new ships has been crippled. We don't even possess the ability to repair the ships that remain. I must say, Your Majesty, we are poorly equipped to face the Austrian navy at sea." The emperor frowned as he heard this and tapped his armrest repeatedly as the noise echoed in the otherwise silent throne room. He could not believe that such an attack had occurred. Not only that, but the Austrians were now laying siege to Verona as he spoke to his vassals. Eventually, the emperor collected his thoughts before asking the question on his mind. "How many ships do we still have?" The Genoan and Venetian doges looked at one another before the Genoan doge answered the emperor's question. "Less than 300, Your Majesty." The emperor sighed when he heard this. If this was the case, then the empire as a whole had between 300 and 400 ships left available for combat. The losses they had suffered in Berengar's sneak attacks were an unmitigated disaster. As such, the emperor asked the following question on his mind. "How many ships do the Austrians have at their disposal?" The Venetian doge was the one to speak as he gave a rough estimate of the Austrian naval power. "In their navy? About 75. However, there also appears to be a half-dozen of these so-called privateers attacking any imperial merchant vessel they can get their hands on. So it is closer to 80 in total. The problem is the Austrian ships are larger and carry far more cannons on board. We don't know the exact number, but they should have thousands of cannons on their 80 or so ships. The emperor gripped his armrest tightly when he heard this report. He gritted his teeth as he struggled to contain his inner fury. Eventually, he calmed himself down before inquiring about information on the firepower that their remaining fleet possessed. "And pray tell, how many cannons do we have on board our vessels?" The Venetian and Genoan doges looked at one another with fear in their eyes. The two men were terrified to answer the question. Ultimately, the Genoan doge mustered the courage to reveal the truth of the matter to the already agitated emperor. "Less than 1,500 in total. The Austrians may have fewer vessels than we do, but their firepower and speed are vastly superior to ours. To engage them in direct conflict is suicidal." This was not the news the emperor wanted to hear. However, it was real, and he was forced to deal with it. As such, the emperor sighed heavily as he placed his face in the palm of his hands while struggling to come up with a solution for the crisis they were facing. "What are the odds of us being able to attack their shipping? If we can return the favor and cripple their economy, then surely we might be able to turn the tides of war around." In response to this question, the Venetian doge was far from calm on this matter as he immediately objected to the notion's feasibility. "Impossible. The Austrian merchant vessels travel at an incredible speed. They are capable of close to 3 times the speed of our ships. There is no feasible method that we can use to pursue them effectively." When Balsamo heard this, he began to grind his teeth in discontent. It appeared as if he were out of options at this point. However, he outright refused to abandon the naval aspect of warfare with the Austrians, and as such, he began to ask for suggestions from the 2 naval experts in the room. "Tell me then, how do you suggest we most effectively utilize our remaining naval power?" With this said, the Genoan doge immediately presented what he believed to be the most efficient use of their ships. "We should use our remaining naval vessels as escorts to our merchant ships. With such a large number of warships protecting our trading fleet, the Austrian pirates will have to think twice about attacking them." Having heard this, the Venetian doge nodded as he voiced support for the proposed plan. "If we cannot protect our merchants, then our economy will crumble, and we will not be able to sustain the war effort against Austria. I support my Genoan counterpart's plan of action." It was quite possibly the first time these two men had agreed on anything, and as such, the emperor was quite surprised. Thus, he sighed heavily before making a decision. "We will do as you suggest then. I would like to see how daring these privateers are when a naval escort protects our merchant fleet." After this was said, the 2 doges nodded their heads in firm resolve. They would immediately relay the orders to their remaining warships to protect merchant convoys at all costs. As such, the emperor dismissed his 2 vassals so they could make the appropriate preparations. As for the emperor, he sighed heavily as he thought about the numerous problems with the war for Austrian independence. While he was sulking in his thoughts, a general came into the fray and handed the emperor a report from the battlefield in the Swiss Confederation. The moment the emperor finished reading the report, he tore it apart in a fit of rage as he chastised his general heavily. "The county of Cour has surrendered without a fight? What lunacy is this?" The general bowed his head respectfully as he tried to appease the enraged emperor. "Your Majesty, the county of Cour is a hotbed of reformist thought. It does not surprise me in the least that they would defect to Berengar's cause. If this is the case in Cour, it could prove to be a potential reality in other parts of the empire that have begun to embrace the German Reformation." The emperor struggled to maintain his dignity as he heard this observation and ultimately failed to do so as he lashed out as his general. "These damned heretics. The fact that you refer to them as reformists shows where your loyalties truly lie. Get out of my sight before I have you executed." The general was shocked to see the emperor behave in such a manner. He was utterly unaware of the conversation that had just taken place and had no way of knowing that the poor news he brought to the emperor was just the icing on the cake. Despite his reservations over his mistreatment, he merely bowed respectfully in response to the emperor's request. With his departure, the general left behind the words, "As you command, Your Majesty." In the end, the emperor was left alone, seething in his enraged state, as his world began to collapse around him. The truth of the matter was, with half of the empire already embroiled in a state of conflict, the emperor was not ready to fight a war with Austria. The Italians had yet to muster their army in its entirety, and 50,000 Austrians were already laying siege to Verona. By the time the Italians could rally their forces to combat the threat, half of northern Italy was likely to be taken by the Royal Austrian army. The emperor may be quick to anger, but he knew well enough that if he met the Austrians in the field, only death awaited him and his men. With this in mind, the emperor began to construct a plot to slow down the Austrian advance and buy him the time necessary to build an army large enough to counter the Austrian invasion of Italy. Chapter 309 For King and Fatherland. Berengar awoke to the thunderous echoes of cannon fire from among his encampment. The weapons went off the moment the sun rose in the sky above the city of Verona. In his army of 50,000 men, Berengar had 3 entire brigades dedicated to artillery that was a total of 12,000 men and 210 field guns. If one were to take his entire army into consideration, Berengar had a total of 5 artillery brigades, 2 of which were currently located in the Swiss Confederation along with Adelbrand and the rest of his forces. Out of 75,000 men, 20,000 of them were dedicated to artillery, with the remaining 55,000 being a mix of infantry and cavalry. That meant that Berengar had a total of 350 artillery pieces in his entire army, most of these being 14, 17, 12 pounds cannons. With these 210 cannons fielded in Berengar's current army, which had a rate of fire of 1 round per minute, he was capable of bombarding a region with 12,600 explosive shells in an hour. As such, the city walls of Verona fell before the population dwelling within had even consumed breakfast. As the northern wall crumbled to the ground from the hellish bombardment, Berengar stood among his forces, clad in his gilded black 3/4 plate armor. He held his burgonet under his arm as he addressed his soldiers gathered in the field. Men of Austria, we have many goals here in Italy, and that is not simply to force the emperor to recognize the independence of the fatherland. With this war, we have been granted an opportunity for the expansion of our people's wealth and prosperity. In this city, and every city like it here in northern Italy, lies a trove of wealth that few countries have ever amassed. There is gold, there is silver, and we will take it all. Now my rules of war still apply to each and every one of you. However, what I ask of you, here today, in Verona, is to plunder every item of value from this city, and bring it back to Austria. We will smelt the silver and gold into our currency, and stimulate the growth of our economy, which has already begun to stagnate. Anyone who tries to stop you in your actions is to be considered an adversary, and should be treated as such. God with us. The moment Berengar finished his passionate speech, the army of 50,000 soldiers gathered around him began chanting their war cry. God with us, God with us, God with us. After saying this, Berengar placed his burgonet on his head and unsheathed his sword before leading the charge into the rubble that once was the city's northern wall. As he charged into the fray, he noticed the few thousand defenders gathered among the rubble, preparing to lay down their lives in defense of the city and the people within it. As such, Berengar halted and allowed his soldiers to form ranks, where a battalion of grenadier fired their shots into the crowd. The moment they did so, the lead projectiles found their way downrange and into the men who had gathered before them, piercing through their iron armor as if it were a knife passing through butter, and with it turning their armor into bloody sieves. For good measure, the grenadier followed the volley by lobbing their grenades at the enemy. After 1,000 grenades went of those were left standing were either blown apart along with their fallen comrades or rendered in a condition unfit for battle. In a matter of seconds, the only thing that stood in the Austrians' way was sorely defeated. In response to this, the battalion who had fired their shots reloaded their weapons, as the other infantry battalions rushed into the fray. Berengar stood back among his grenadier as he allowed them to reload their weapons in a matter of seconds with their quick loading tubes. After doing so, they advanced over the piles of mutilated corpses and into the city of Verona, where the chaotic scene displayed itself. While Berniger's troops were disciplined thoroughly, to the point where killing or raping civilians was strictly off limits, they had been ordered to ransack the city, and as such, they behaved like a horde of barbarians, kicking down doors and tearing the houses apart looking for anything of value. Those few citizens who dared to resist found themselves gunned down, or ran through with a bayonet. In this chaotic time, the denizens of Verona found themselves gazing in horror as their city was torn apart by a horde of Austrian soldiers. Berengar personally led his troops to the area he knew to be stashed with the most significant amount of wealth, and that was the city's cathedral. When he kicked down the door to the church, the priests and citizens who had taken refuge inside gazed upon the Austrians with horror, as if they were the same barbarians who tore Rome apparent centuries ago. The priest immediately approached Berengar and got in his path as he entered the building, holding a cross in his face and proclaiming the cathedral to be unassailable. "This is holy ground, you devils cannot be here, turn back or face the wrath of God." Upon this priest's neck was a golden crucifix worth a substantial sum, and as such Berengar gazed at the men with a wicked smile before grabbing a hold of him by the necklace. As he did so he stared into the priest's eyes before mocking him. "Relax, I'm not here for your worthless lives, only the wealth you church hoards away." With this said, Berengar ripped the golden crucifix from the priest's neck before knocking him out with a solid punch. The steel gauntlet on Berengar's hand aided in the desired effect. As the priest tumbled to the ground, Berengar caught a hold of him, to make sure he did not crack his skull on the wooden pews, and gently laid him to the ground. As he did so, the crowd of civilians shrieked in horror. However, Berengar simply ignored them before commanding his grenadier to strip the cathedral of its wealth. "Take everything of value, and leave the people be unless they make an attempt on your life. Do no harm unto them." With this said, the Austrian soldiers began to tear down the crucifixes, stash away the chalices, and even tore down the golden statue of Christ himself, before carrying it away. After everything of value from the church had been seized, Berengar and his troops left the cathedral in a bare state, with the civilians inside bawling like children. It did not take an army of 50,000 men long to ransack everything of worth within the city of Verona, and they had turned the city upside down in the process. After acquiring every small piece of gold and silver, and transferring it into a giant pile outside the city, Berengar stood before his troops and gazed upon the wealth that Verona had stashed away. An avaricious smirk was spread upon the young monarch's face as he witnessed the spoils of war. Yet, it was not enough. The true prize was in the city of Florence, for there lay an exceptionally wealthy family of bankers, who had the fortune to rival even Berengar. This family was not yet nobility, and yet they held enough wealth to finance Berengar's enemies, that being the entirety of the Catholic Church. Berengar's true goal in this war was not something as simple as independence. It was to strip away every bit of gold and silver the Medici had stashed away, and cripple the Vatican's ability to finance a crusade against him. Austrian independence and the establishment of a separate northern Italian kingdom as a protectorate beneath his suzerainty was secondary to acquiring the vast fortune of the Medicis. However, those were plans for the near future. For now, Berengar had other thoughts in mind. As such, he gave yet another impassioned speech to his troops as they gazed upon the wealth they had acquired from Venice with greed. "Any man among you who has through a moment of weakness stashed away some spoils gained in this battle, step forward and add it to the pile, and I will grant you impunity. I know the hearts of men. I too have the instinct to hoard this pile of gold away in some corner of Austria, never allowing it to see the light of day. Yet, I am strong enough in my conviction to utilize every speck of wealth we have gained here on this day, and in our future campaign in Italy, for one single purpose: the minting of currency. I will not lie to you, our kingdom faces economic stagnation. There is not enough gold and silver to go around, to fill the pockets of the people of Austria who work every day for a better future. This wealth is intended not for my personal fortune, but for the prosperity of all Austrians. So, those among you who have stashed away some of the gains you have found within this city, I implore you once more to step forward, and add it to the pile, if not for yourselves, then for the good of kingdom." There was silence for some time until one man, in particular, walked forward. This man was Captain Arnwald. He was a man respected by the soldiers under his command. As Berengar had said, in a moment of weakness he had stashed away a small pouch filled with gold coins within his belt's containers. After the man had emptied the pouch of coins into the vast pile, it did not take long before more men followed suit, and emptied their hidden wealth onto the pile. Before long, over half the army had done so, until not a single missing piece of treasure remained in the hands of his soldiers. As Berengar saw this, he nodded his head and smiled upon his men. In doing so, he made them a solemn vow. "For your loyalty and faith in your fatherland, I will make you a promise here on this day. Every single piece of this treasure shall be used to invest in the future of the Kingdom of Austria. With it you and your families shall see greater heights of prosperity. Make no mistake, you all shall see your fair share of the spoils we gain in this war." After saying this, Arnwald saluted Berengar and voiced his chant, "For king and fatherland." After saying so, the entire army repeated these words in unison. After this speech was over, Berengar had every piece of treasure that was pooled in the pile recorded, and then sent a convoy of 5,000 men to ensure its safe return to the royal treasury of Austria. Berengar would stay true to his vow, and use the vast stockpile of gold and silver, by smelting it down into the pure currency he had established. In doing so, he was able to temporarily stall the stagnation issues his economy was currently facing, and do so bring greater prosperity to all of Austria. Chapter 310 Selling Stolen Goods. After Honoria and her crew had attacked and ransacked 2 imperial vessels, they immediately made their way to the port of Trieste. Trieste quickly became a significant trading hub within Austria, as it was the realm's largest harbor. After several days of sailing, Honoria and her crew finally arrived within the city, where they intended to sell the goods they had captured for a fair price. As such, Honoria, with Melissa and Elfrin by her side, stepped off of the vessel and began to search the marketplace for an appropriate buyer. The rest of her crew were waiting on board the vessels, guarding the prisoners and waiting for their pay so that they could get in a little R&R. After strolling through the markets of Trieste for some time, Honoria came across a textile trader. The Granadan merchant was stunned to see a group of women dressed in pants and clad with weapon belts walking around in the Trieste market. His first instinct was to ignore the 3 women. Fortunately for him, they began to approach the merchant, and as such, he let out a sigh before putting on a friendly facade. "How can I help you?" With this in mind, Honoria took out 2 shipping manifests that she had captured from the imperial vessels. "We have these goods to sell. I am sure you might be interested in our wares." The merchant looked through the items listed on the manifests. Initially, he had a dull expression, however when he gazed across their contents his dark eyes quickly shined with avarice. The goods on this manifest were of the highest quality of Byzantine silk and Indian cotton. It was not easy for a merchant from Granadan like him to get a hold of such items, and as such, he was greatly interested in bringing the materials back to the emirate to sell for a profit. Of course, silk and cotton were not the only things that caught his interest. The purple dye was the most attractive of all the goods that the women had to offer. After thinking about it for a few moments, the merchant began to inquire about the origins of such fine materials. "Where did you get such exquisite items? If these goods were stolen, it could cause quite some difficulty to the man, and judging by the attire these women were dressed in, they likely weren't merchants." However, to the man's surprise, Honoria pulled out a letter and handed it to the man. This piece of parchment was the letter of marque and reprisal that Berengar had signed, permitting Honoria to engage in piracy against the Kingdom of Austria's enemies. By now, the term privateer had become quite notorious among the merchants of the Mediterranean. Berengar's introduction of privateering was an action heavily criticized by various states who had coastlines within the region. Despite these protests, many merchants were willing to purchase such wares as they could be resold at a substantially higher rate in their home countries. As such, the merchant was far from reluctant to buy the goods. If anything, it was in his favor that these women had found him to fence their ill-gotten gains. After thinking about it for some time, the man raised 2 fingers to name his price for the goods. "I will pay 10,000 Austrian thalers for the cotton and silk. As for the purple dye, I am greatly interested in it, but the cost is negotiable." Upon hearing the merchant's offer, Honoria discussed the costs with her crew members. "I think it is a good deal. That is a substantial sum, and is slightly below market value. After all, the merchant has to resell the goods to make a profit. As for the purple dye, we have 5 pounds of the substance, and the dye is worth 3 times its weight in gold. As such, we should demand guldens in exchange for it." Melissa nodded her head in agreement. The gulden was used for large transactions such as this, and they highly doubted the merchant had 107,143 Austrian thalers lying around. As such, she quickly agreed to Honoria's proposal. "I agree. The gulden is better to trade with. The amount of dye we have is worth roughly 1,530 Austrian guldens. This is a fortune. We should ask for 1,500, so he can still make a decent profit." Elfrin was primarily left out of the conversation. As such, Honoria and Melissa agreed to pose their offer to the Granadan merchant. Honoria put on a confident facade as she did so. "My offer is 1,500 guldens. If you don't like it, I am sure that other merchants would kill for the opportunity to buy such a stockpile of purple dye for the price I have offered." The merchant knew the market value of such a precious substance, and it could be sold for an even greater price in Granada than here in Austria. After all, relations between Granada and Byzantium were complicated to say the least, as such trade between the two nations had suffered greatly over the years. Very well, if you would transfer the materials to my vessel, I will meet you there with the promised sum. It is a pleasure doing business with you girls. After saying this, the man gave them the information on the location to meet up, and Honoria and the others returned to their ship, where they began to gather the resources for the trade. Just by selling the textiles and dye, they had gained a substantial profit. If deposited into the National Bank of Austria, they could withdraw the amount of value from the Austrian guldens in their thaler equivalent, roughly 490 Austrian thalers per Austrian gulden. Before long, the members of Honoria's crew handed over the goods in exchange for several chests filled with Austrian thalers and guldens. After carefully calculating the goods and checking to see if there were any counterfeits, Honoria accepted the transaction. After returning to the sloop of war known as Honoria's Revenge, the crew gathered around the multiple chests filled with the large silver and gold coins. They could not believe their eyes, as they gazed upon the pile of wealth. The wealth sitting before them was enough to buy a manor for several of the crew members and retire peacefully. However, greed was a natural human instinct. After seeing how much fortune they had gained without suffering any casualties, not a single woman among Honoria's crew desired to retire after a mere 2 battles. Silver and gold had an unnatural effect on the human mind. Men and women alike would be willing to stab their siblings in the back for more of the substance. However, rather than turn on each other, these women desired to raid the merchants of the Holy Roman Empire. Reflecting upon her own internal desire to do so, Honoria decided to give a speech to her crew. We will be distributing the wealth we have gained to each member of the crew in equal shares. We are all one family on board Honoria's Revenge, and thus we will share our fortune equally. You may do what you wish when it comes to your wealth. However, I will be depositing my share into the National Bank of Austria under an account in my name, and I advise you to do the same. It is far safer under the protection of the Austrian crown than it is hidden away in some far corner of the world. After saying this, not a single woman among the gathered crew members could disagree with Honoria's words. They were privateers licensed by the Austrian crown and afforded legal protection in that regard. They were no mere pirates, thus they did not have to worry about their assets being seized by the government. Before long, Honoria and her crew had sold all of their goods, including the carrack they had gained from the Genoan merchants, amassing a substantial fortune on their first run. With this in mind, Honoria kept her word and divided the shares equally among her crew members. This was the result of the first of many pillages that the wenches of Honoria's Revenge would engage in during the Austrian War for Independence. Chapter 311 – The Italians Strike Back. While Berengar was marching onto his next target, which was the city of Milan, his supply routes were being maintained by the 5,000 soldiers who had transferred the treasure hoard gained from ransacking Verona. These men were dedicated to ensuring that the main army was well supplied and that any spoils were transported back to the royal treasury in Kufstein. However, due to the nature of their mission, they swiftly became targeted by the Italian forces. Because the Italians could not contend with Austria in the field, they had begun to resort to skirmishing tactics against their enemies' scouting regiments. Since this was the way that they had chosen to engage in warfare, Berengar had devised a series of search and destroy tactics to hunt down the ambushers in advance of his march. As for the logistical network, Berengar had increased the number of soldiers among their ranks from 5,000 to 5,500, adding a few scouts with them to ensure that the path ahead was secure. At the moment, this force of soldiers was led by the colonel, who was Captain Arnwald's superior officer, with Arnwald's grenadier unit acting as the central offensive unit within their ranks. Currently, this supply caravan was in the middle of their encampment, within the fields between the Italian Alps and Milan. It was early morning, and the men had just woken up. They were in the process of tearing down the camp so that they could begin their long march to Milan, where Berengar's main army was sure to be located. Captain Arnwald was sharing a hemp cigarette between himself and the colonel as they discussed their plans over a map within the command tent. Our supply route should lead us safely to the front lines where we can resupply King Berengar and his forces. The scouts have spotted ahead, and they have assured us that there are no traps or ambushes laid out within our path. Give it another day or two, and we should have arrived at our destination without incident. Arnwald, on the other hand, was not convinced. Things had been quiet since they had begun their journey back to the front lines. Over a week had passed since the siege of Verona, and during this time, they had traveled to Kufstein and back. Yet not once had they encountered an enemy ambush or any attempt at it. It was mind-boggling. After all, the best tactic the Italians could come up with to slow down the Austrian advance was ambushing smaller units detached from the main Austrian army. Despite being separated from the main force and tasked with the essential job of maintaining the supply routes into Italy, the Italians had seemingly ignored their intrusion. It was almost as if they were watching and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike while the Austrians least expected it. This made Arnwald quite paranoid, as he was confident the Italians would have targeted the Austrian logistical network. Regardless, neither the scouts nor the intelligence agency had informed them of any nearby hostiles. As Arnwald and the colonel discussed their plans for the remainder of their journey, an unarmored Italian knight dressed in simple attire was located in the distance, overlooking the Austrian encampment from the hilltops above. The Italian crown had become aware of the infiltration into northern Italy by Berengar's spy network. In response to this threat, the Italians had adopted a compelling tactic. They had begun to shed their arms and armor and travel under the guise of refugee and merchant caravans. After all, their armor was practically useless in the face of Austria's wonder weapons. The difference between these caravans and actual refugee groups was that they were comprised of the battle-hardened soldiers of Italy and their hidden arms, which were needed to ambush the Austrian armies. They had even brought women and children along with them to make things convincing, not fearing what would happen to the poor souls once the battle had erupted. After carefully observing the Austrian encampment and the soldiers within it for some time, the Italian knight rode his horse back to his unit, where he informed his commanding officers of what he had discovered. Since the Austrians were in the middle of tearing down their camp, it was the perfect time to ambush them. Before long, this so-called refugee convoy approached the Austrian forces, who were in the middle of preparing to move out. Because of this, there were only a few men on guard, and as such, it took some time before the Italian caravan was spotted between the hillsides of the Milanese plains. When the Austrians finally realized that an unknown caravan was approaching, the guards lowered their weapons towards the approaching strangers. However, before they could utter their commands, the men on horseback within the Italian forces unleashed their blades and charged towards the guards, piercing through their open-face helmets and reaping their lives. The moment the cavalry charged into the encampment, a large group of the Italian soldiers split off and began to swarm the Austrian soldiers before they could grab a hold of their weapons to retaliate. As the Italian men at arms charged towards the Austrian soldiers, arrows and bolts had begun to fly into the encampment. The camp quickly found itself wholly overrun with the Italian soldiers who began to butcher the Austrian soldiers that struggled to equip themselves in an attempt to counter the well-planned ambush. While chaos erupted in the camp, a soldier rushed into the command tent, informing the colonel and Captain Arnwald of the enemy ambush. "Sir, we are under attack." Both the colonel and Captain Arnwald gazed at each other with confusion. Just where did the enemy soldiers come from? Despite their questions, both officers knew now was not the time to ask, but instead, firm action was needed to be taken if they wished to survive the enemy ambush. With this in mind, the colonel and Captain Arnwald burst from the command tent and began to rally their troops for battle. "Form ranks. Grab your muskets and form ranks, damn it." Hearing the confident voice of their commanding officer pierce through the air was enough to snap the nearby soldiers into their senses, where their reflexes as battle-hardened veterans immediately took over. Now was the time for the extensive training they had been put through to truly reveal itself. The soldiers rushed into their tents, where they retrieved their 1,417 18th rifled muskets, along with their web gear that contained their munitions. Before long, the Austrians began to form ranks while firing upon the so-called refugees who had snuck into their encampment. Thousands of Austrians had now armed themselves with their muskets and began to effectively counter the Italian assault. As they rapidly reloaded their weapons and fired a second volley, the Italian forces were quickly cut to ribbons. As the battle continued to wage, Arnwald rallied his grenadier, who fulfilled their purpose as the shock troops of the Austrian army. Without fear, they began to load their muskets and fire into the mob of Italian soldiers. After doing so, they lit their grenades and lobbed them into the fray. Once the grenades had exploded, killing hundreds of Italians in the process, they fixed their bayonets. Where the fearless grenadier charged at the concussed soldiers of the Italian army, skewering them with the triangular steel blades, leaving the Italians to bleed out in a pool of their bodily fluids. While this was going on, a few dozen Italian knights recovered muskets from the fallen Austrian soldiers. After doing so, they immediately mounted their horses and fled into the distance. The moment they did so, the remaining Italian soldiers took notice and began to retreat, providing cover to the knights as they escaped from the chaotic battlefield. The tides of war rapidly shifted in the Austrians' favor. As the Austrians regained their footing, the Italian ambushers were quickly slaughtered like a bunch of stray dogs. The battle had ended as soon as it had begun with an overwhelming victory for the Austrian soldiers. Unfortunately, the knights had gotten away with a few dozen muskets, which they would undoubtedly bring back the Empire's engineers. One thing was sure. Such a result would have far-reaching consequences about the leaking of technology and the advancements that Berengar's enemies would soon come to possess. The days of overwhelming technological dominance would quickly come to an end. If Berengar did not innovate his armies further, he would soon be combating forces with a similar military capacity to his own. Chapter 312 Fall of Zurich. While the Austrian supply caravan had suffered many losses on their journey to the city of Milan due to the enemy ambush, Adalbrand had been marching towards the rally point of the Swiss forces within the city of Zurich. Until now, the Swiss had not tasted the power of steel and shot, and as such, they were fairly arrogant. Aside from the mercenaries who were wiped out during Berengar's rise to power, the Swiss had not become aware of the effectiveness of Berengar's weaponry and refused to believe that the Austrians had become superior to their mighty forces. As such, there was a degree of arrogance among the Swiss armies gathered in Zurich as they witnessed the Austrian soldiers clad in their black and gold equipment arriving outside their city's borders. The commander of the Swiss forces gathered in Zurich was the Duke of Zurich. He was the current head of the Swiss Confederation and was a man of renowned power within the Alpine state. As he gazed upon the gathering Austrian army below his ramparts, a smug smile formed on his face. As he boldly declared the city's impregnability, "I don't care what wonder weapons these Austrians have allegedly created, they will not be able to penetrate through the mighty walls of my city." However, the moment the man said this, the echo of the 14, 17, 12-pound artillery pieces roared through the air as the shells whistled by and detonated upon the mighty stone walls of the city. In a fit of cosmic irony, the section of the wall that the Duke of Zurich was standing upon was struck by one of these shells. The explosive impact crushed the ramparts and sent him spiraling below to his death. With each barrage fired, the stone walls were rapidly chipped away as the explosive blasts engulfed the material that they were comprised of. With 140 cannons unleashing hell upon the city's walls, it was only a matter of hours before they were brought to rubble, much to the chagrin of the Swiss defenders. As the Austrian soldiers came pouring over the rubble that was once the mighty walls of the city, deemed impregnable by the Duke of Zurich, the Swiss could hardly believe the sight. In such a short period, the city walls were brought to ruin, and the enemy had rushed into the fray. With their bayonets affixed, they formed ranks and fired on the stunned Swiss defenders. Adalbrand gazed upon his army from afar as they advanced into the city and engaged in battle with the Swiss soldiers who had gathered within its gates. Unfortunately, they arrived early and were battling only half of the troops the Swiss Confederation could manage to field. Without a shadow of a doubt, Zurich would fall on this day, and with it, half of the Swiss army. With this in mind, Adalbrand approached the front lines of the battle, where he witnessed the Austrian soldiers gunning down the Swiss spearmen who rushed towards the Austrian lines. They had not been informed that human wave tactics did not affect the Austrian army. As the Swiss stepped ever closer to the Austrian lines, smoke filled the air, and thunder echoed in the distance as thousands of guns went off in unison, shredding through the armor of the Swiss soldiers like a knife through butter, and tearing apart their internal organs. Blood and bone scattered across the battlefield with each volley, creating panic among the Swiss forces. In the height of their hubris, they had not believed for a moment that the Austrian weapons could so easily pierce through their high-quality armor. The Duke of Zurich was now buried beneath the rubble of the wall he was standing on, his head squashed like a melon as the giant piece of stone debris replaced where his skull once was. He had not survived the initial barrage and therefore could not rally the city's defenders behind him. With their chain of command broken, it did not take long for the Swiss soldiers to break ranks and flee from the city's rear gates, struggling to break through at the expense of their comrades' lives. Unlike in Italy, the plan was not to raid and plunder the cities of Switzerland for their worth. Instead, it was a matter of conquest and annexation. Thus, while Swiss soldiers fled the city rapidly, the Austrians secured the critical areas while leaving the civilians to their own devices. After a few hours, the battle had come to a close, and all resistance within the once mighty city of Zurich had fallen. The Austrian flag was slowly raised above its walls as Adelbrand gazed upon the setting sun with a stoic expression. While gazing off into the distance, his second-in-command approached him and relayed the information that he had received. Out of the 10,000 soldiers of the Swiss army who were stationed in Zurich, over half of them were killed in battle. As for our casualties, less than 1,000 men were wounded or killed in action. What are the plans for the deceased? Adelbrand sighed before shifting his attention from the beautiful sunset towards his executive officer. Bring the Austrians back to the fatherland and have them buried in the national cemetery. As for the Swiss soldiers, bury them most fittingly. We are here to rule over these people, and thus we should not make a mockery of their dead. The officer nodded his head in response to these orders. While he did so, he prepared to leave before remembering he had a note in his pocket that had arrived from the Italian front. With this in mind, he retrieved the letter and read its contents to General Adelbrand. The supply caravan tasked with providing logistical support to Berengar's army has been ambushed. They suffered minimal casualties, and a few dozen muskets were looted. Berengar has advised all forces that the enemy may disguise themselves as refugees or merchants and that we should remain vigilant. It would appear the enemy has realized that they cannot contend with us in the field and thus are utilizing some unconventional tactics. After hearing this, Adelbrand sighed heavily before giving his orders to the officer. Double the protection of our logistical network, and relay these orders to the officers in charge. I don't want any mishaps here on our campaign. If the Italians have adopted such tactics, it is only a matter of time before the Swiss do as well. After hearing this, the officer saluted General Adelbrand before responding in the affirmative. Yes, sir. General Adelbrand returned the man's salute before giving him one last order for the day. Dismissed. With that having been said, the officer left the area where Adelbrand was standing, and the general was left by his lonesome, gazing off into the beautiful sunset that filled the sky with a unique blend of orange and purple light. Only one thought escaped the man's lips as he reflected on this new information he received. Looks like things won't be so boring after all. With these events, the war for Austrian independence had taken a new turn. The days of significant field battles and human wave tactics would soon come to an end, as the Italian and Swiss forces would engage in unconventional warfare against the numerically and technologically superior forces of the Royal Austrian Army. The Austrian occupation and annexation of Switzerland would become a long and brutal conflict, as the non-German population was sure to retaliate against the forces who presided over them with an iron fist. Berengar had no use of those who did not toe the line, and rebellion could not be tolerated. Despite the Austrian conquest of Zurich, the war for Switzerland had only just begun. Whether General Adelbrand could adapt to the new tactics employed by the enemy had yet to be seen. Chapter 313 Kielhold. Among the crew of Honoria's Revenge, one lass, in particular, stood out among the primarily European crew. This woman was named Naziha El Fahmy. She was a woman from the Mamluk Sultanate who had made her way to Austria as a slave sometime earlier in her life. However, due to Berengar's legal reforms that outlawed slavery within the Kingdom of Austria, Naziha soon found herself accessible and incapable of working. After all, she was both a woman and a minority, and she was not afforded the privileges that the normal Austrians received. With nowhere to go in life, she had ended up selling her body to sustain herself within the city of Kufstein. After all, a foreign beauty was a highly desirable object by many of the patrons who visited the brothel where she had previously worked. Naziha was out purchasing supplies on one fateful day when she came across Princess Honoria, who had introduced herself as Valeria Zonera. The two ended up chatting for some time before the runaway princess gave Naziha an offer, one where she could live a life of freedom and fortune. After carefully considering the offer, Naziha had joined Valeria's crew. She did not mind that Valeria was a Byzantine, despite their two peoples being bitter enemies for centuries. After all, it was not like she was a member of the Byzantine aristocracy who was responsible for the numerous invasions into her people's lands. Or so she thought, and as such, she had been enjoying her time as a member of Honoria's crew. However, the more she utilized the weapons provided to her by the Austrian crown, the more she became convinced that such weapons needed to be smuggled into her homeland so that they could be used to repel the Byzantine invaders. Due to Austria's military aid, most of Egypt and Libya had fallen to the Byzantines. With it, the most economic regions of her homeland had fallen to their bitter enemies. As a profoundly patriotic woman, Naziha desired to aid her people in whatever way she could. Thus, while the crew of Honoria's Revenge was docked in the city of Benghazi to sell the loot they had acquired from the vessels they had recently ransacked, Naziha was undertaking another mission. Hidden beneath her cloak was one of the 1421 repeating flintlocks that Berengar had designed for Honoria's use. She was secretly heading to a clandestine meeting between herself and a representative of the Mamluk Sultanate. Unbeknownst to her, she had been followed by a mysterious agent in the shadows. For over a year now, Linda's spy network had expanded to Byzantium and the Mamluk Sultanate. With the opening of trade routes across the Mediterranean largely in part to Berengar's naval expansion, opportunities for embedding agents across the coastal regions of the sea presented themselves. Never one to miss an opportunity, Lind had taken this chance to expand and strengthen her spy network. As such, a small cell of Austria's intelligence agency was located in Benghazi and had become aware of this meetup. They had quickly identified the target and followed her to the meeting, where she was now standing face to face with a member of the Mamluk military. The man was a high-ranking official tasked by the Sultan to procure the advanced weaponry that the woman claimed she had come across. As he stood in front of Naziha, he asked the question on his mind. "Do you have what you have promised to bring?" Naziha nodded her head silently before revealing the repeating flintlock. The moment the officer gazed upon the weapon, he knew it was not something remotely similar to the arquebuses in use by the Byzantine forces. As such, he reached out and grabbed a hold of the weapon, pointing it into the air and cocking the action back before firing. The shot flew into the air, and after it had done so, he cocked the flintlock back and fired again. After several uses of the weapon, the officer nodded his head with an excited grin curved upon his lips. He handed the gun off to a subordinate before taking out a small chest filled with gold coins, which he handed over to Naziha. "Your service to the Sultanate is greatly appreciated. A small reward on behalf of the Sultan is proof of his gratitude." Naziha's eyes widened as she saw this wealth and quickly grasped a hold of it before stashing it away beneath her cloak. She bowed her head respectfully before departing from the meeting area. The young Arab woman was utterly unaware that after she had left earshot, the officer and his assistant were assassinated by the Austrian agents. The weapon was recovered, and Honoria had been informed of the woman's betrayal. As such, when Naziha finally returned to the vessel after spending her newfound wealth on frivolities, she found Honoria and the crew gathered before her, armed and ready to restrain her. Naziha knew not what she had done to invoke their ire, but she knew she was in trouble. However, before she could escape, one of the girls hit her on the back of the head with the stock of her firearm, knocking the lass out completely. When she finally came to, she was tied up with steel wire rope and lined against the ship's edge. Naziha had no idea that her treachery had been revealed and attempted to plead with Honoria. "Captain, what are you doing? Let me go. I have done nothing wrong." However, in response, Honoria simply sneered in disgust before retrieving the repeating flintlock that Naziha had sold to the Sultanate. The weapon had the same proof mark and the serial number of the musket she had handed over to the Sultanate, and after observing this, the Arab beauty's eyes widened in disbelief. Seeing Naziha's expression, a sadistic grin curved itself upon Honoria's immaculate lips as she asked the question on her mind. "Do you deny that you have sold the weapons afforded to you by the Austrian crown to its enemies?" After hearing this question, Naziha looked away. She knew there was nothing she could say to prove her innocence. Evidently, the agents of the Austrian crown had found out about her betrayal, and they had the evidence to prove it. As such, the woman accepted her fate, though she had no way of knowing just how cruel the punishment for her crimes was. With the evidence presented before the crew and a lack of denial for the crimes, Honoria declared Naziha's guilt for all of the crew to witness. Naziha el-Fahmi, for supplying the rivals of the Austrian crown with the advanced weapons His Majesty's generosity has afforded us. You have not only betrayed this crew but endangered the lives of every one of your sisters who you have fought beside. For the crime of treason and mutiny, there is only one punishment. I sentence you to be keelhauled. May God have mercy on your soul." With this decree uttered, the steel wire rope bindings were looped beneath the vessel before Naziha was tossed into the Mediterranean. As the ship sailed through the sea, Naziha was slowly dragged along the keel of the vessel. Multiple lacerations accumulated on her back as she was violently forced across the sharp steel-plated keel. Whether the woman bled out in the water or drowned was uncertain. However, what was undeniable was that Naziha had died a miserable death for her actions against the crew, and more importantly, the crown of Austria. If Berengar's agents were not already in Benghazi spying on the Sultanate for the Byzantine Empire, then, the likelihood of Berengar's rivals reversing engineering such advanced weaponry within the next 10 years was high. Luckily for Austria, their intelligence network had spread across the Mediterranean and was able to intercept such valuable technology before it fell into the wrong hands. With the increase in trade to the regions of the Mediterranean, Berengar was able to easily infiltrate the societies that shared the sea, to what degree depended entirely on the area his agents had entered. With this in mind, Honoria sighed heavily as she returned to her captain's quarters with a bottle of whiskey in her hands. It was never easy to punish someone you thought of as a friend after they had betrayed you. As such, the runaway princess began to sulk alone in her room. As she drank from the whiskey bottle, she expressed the thoughts on her mind. Berengar, I miss you. When will you return home? Honoria was utterly unaware that Elfrin had been listening to her complaints from the other side of her door, with an ugly expression on her otherwise cute face. The fact that Honoria thought of Berengar in such times greatly annoyed the adolescent girl. As such, she refused to stand by and listen to Honoria's words. Instead, she departed from the corridor in silence. Nobody ever was aware that she had been eavesdropping on the captain. Chapter 314 Formation of the National Militia. While Berengar was off at war, Chancellor Otto von Gratz was running the state in his absence. While there were a few garrisons located throughout the kingdom, the fear of invasion from foreign powers had begun to infect the minds of a small portion of the populace. In response to this, Count Otto devised an idea and presented it before the Reichstag. This idea was loosely based upon some of the drunken ramblings Otto had engaged with between himself and King Berengar in the days before the war. Otto was an efficient statesman who was entirely capable of being inspired by Berengar's half-brained intoxicated ideas and turning them into a practical reality. At this moment, the Chancellor of Austria was standing within the Reichstag, speaking his mind to the congressman who was gathered within. As a representative of the people, Gunther was among the crowd of men elected by people of all social standings to represent the people's interests. As such, he was privy to the ideas presented by the Chancellor as he spoke with passion. Months ago, I discussed with King Berengar about a matter of critical importance to the safety and security of the Kingdom of Austria. We spoke about the possibility to form a National Guard, a registered and well-regulated group of civilians who undergo military training on weekends and act as an extension of the pre-existing armed forces. The purpose of this National Guard is to ensure that the Austrian people are sufficiently armed and trained to defend their life and property in the event that foreigners were to invade our country. Today, I have given every one of you a copy of my proposed plan for the Austrian National Guard. All able-bodied men between the ages of 16 to 20 will be required to undergo weekly training based upon military standards, including physical fitness, firearms training, and tactics. Of course, these men will be appropriately compensated for the time spent training in the militia. This said, I will leave this proposed bill for all of you to look over and discuss. However, now more than ever, I think it is pertinent that we make sure that Austria is well protected from all internal and external threats. With these words spoken, the Chancellor left the podium and returned to his chateau in Kufstein, where he began to relax until an agreement could be made between the legislature and himself. He had nothing to do while the Reichstag debated among themselves, and as such he enjoyed a nice cup of coffee. While Otto was enjoying his free time with leisure, Gunther was in the middle of looking over the proposal. It was by no means a poor idea, and he knew that Austria had the capability to supply the militia with the weapons necessary for their objectives. As such, he was in favor of the idea of establishing a national militia. After all, the garrisons spread throughout Austria were not enough to protect the fields and the village folk from a potential invasion. With this in mind, he looked over at the other representatives in a fierce debate with one another. Many of them had sons that were within the age group listed and feared their children being forced to take up arms to defend the nation should it come under attack. Gunther decided he would do his best to convince the Reichstag to agree to Chancellor Otto's terms. The man shivered in anxiety as he approached the podium and tried to gain the attention of the arguing representatives. Excuse me, however, his actions went completely unnoticed. As such, he decided to steel his resolve and speak with some force behind his tone. Quiet down. When Gunther shouted these words at the top of his lungs, everyone finally noticed that someone was standing at the podium and was intrigued as such. Gunther cleared his throat before speaking in an authoritative voice. Some of you may not be aware of who I am, but my name is Gunther. I am a representative selected by the people of Kufstein to represent their interests. I know many of those among you come from noble upbringing, but allow me to tell you who I am. Until 4 years ago, I was a common serf. I tended to the fields in the name of my masters, the von Kufstein family. When I first met King Berengar, he was a frail, sickly youth, but he had a dream. A dream of a self-sustaining Kufstein where the people were appropriately compensated for their labor. It is a dream that any man, regardless of their upbringing, could achieve in life whatever they desired based upon their merit. At first, I thought he was just an idealistic youth, but I have seen the town I grew up in transform into a marvelous city over these last 4 years. Berengar von Kufstein conquered Tyrol after Count Lothar betrayed Duke Wilmar through the hard work of better men than me. To my surprise, the man who once toiled a field beside me was now the Count of Tyrol, and with it, he brought the same innovations that had led his barony to prosperity to the entirety of the county. Yet that was not enough. As the Bavarians invaded, Berengar led the men of Tyrol to retake Austria as a whole. Unfortunately, the Duke and his line had passed away in its entirety shortly after, and Berengar was named the new Duke. We have had a stable peace throughout these past 2 years, allowing us to grow in wealth and prosperity. King Berengar has done the unthinkable. He has created a world where a lowly farmer like myself can own my land and operate it entirely with my family. The wealth I have gained from this has allowed me to buy more land and expand upon that. I now have a factory under construction that will be producing paper from the products I grow. 4 years ago, I could never imagine such a fate, but this is the reality we all see. Without Berengar, and the brave men who have laid down their lives to pave the way for this future, I would not be where I am today. I likely would have starved to death alongside my family in a particularly harsh winter. So, I think it is the duty of all men, capable of bearing arms, to at the very least provide a last line of defense for our homeland. While our soldiers are away at war securing our independence, the responsibility to protect our homes, our families, our businesses, and most importantly, our nation should fall to every able-bodied man in Austria. I, for one, support the move for a National Guard, and I hope that every one of you will reflect upon what you have gained from the sacrifice of young men who have fought and died to achieve what we have all gained under Berengar's leadership. That is all I have to say. With this impassioned speech, Gunther stepped down from the podium and returned to his seat. As he did so, he heard a slow clap, which began to spread. Before long, the entire room was filled with applause. After he did so, the House leader stood up at the podium and began to cast a vote. All in favor of the establishment of a national militia as proposed by Chancellor Otto von Gratz? After Gunther's speech, those who had reservations about the bill were silenced and even showed their support for the idea. The decision was ultimately unanimous, and after the Reichstag passed it, it would be sent to the Senate, where they would vote upon it. It was only after it was approved in the Senate that it would be sent to the Chancellor's office, where in Berengar's absence, he had the authority to sign it into law. The Militia Act of 1421 would become the first significant piece of legislation passed entirely by the fledgling semi-constitutional government that Berengar had established. While he was away at war, the capable hands he had left Austria's governance to begin the progress of creating a society where martial training at a young age would one day be considered the norm. Chapter 315 The Princess of Granada. While the war for Austria's independence was ongoing within the Kingdom of Italy and the Swiss Confederation, another battle was beginning to intensify as the Granadans fought against the Iberian Union. Due to Austrian military aid, the Granadan forces had multiplied and were relatively well trained, at least compared to their enemies. While Hassan's soldiers were engaged in a bloody conflict at his borders defending the last vestige of Al-Andalus, he was busy entertaining himself with women and wine. At the moment, Hassan was back at his palace in Granada. Unlike Berengar, he had no desire to lead from the front lines. The few battles he waged were enough to last him a lifetime. Instead, he left the war effort to his commanders with the aid of the Austrian military advisors. The young sultan enjoyed himself on a sofa while his wives attended to his needs, feeding him a bowl of grapes while he sipped on his fortified wine. During Hassan's purge, Berengar's guards had killed one of his wives who attempted to take his life, and he had eliminated another who was loyal to the fundamentalist faction. As such, the young sultan currently had no more than 2 wives. Despite this, he was looking to expand his harem. However, he would not accept just any woman. He wanted a harem of beautiful young women to take care of his needs as Berengar had obtained. While basking in hedonism, a gorgeous young woman approached the young sultan. This woman was quite tall and had an exceptionally curvy figure. One could say her measurements hit the perfect ratio, and her bust was even more significant than Linda's. Her tan skin glistened with sweat from the heat of the arid climate that surrounded the city of Granada. This woman was dressed in a traditional silk kaftan-style dress dyed purple and had golden embroidery on it. She wore a matching face veil made of sheer silk, giving it a semi-translucent appearance. Her dark hair was tied up into a ponytail, and her glistening amber eyes were enough to intoxicate any man who gazed upon the vivid gemstones that were her irises. This woman was not one of Hassan's wives. Instead, it was his older sister Yasmin. When she saw her little brother lazing about with his wives, instead of leading his armies, she crossed her arms beneath her heavy bosom and began to chastise the young sultan as if he were a mere child. My, what do I see here? If it isn't my sweet little brother, here you are lazing about in Granada while you send your soldiers to die on the front lines against our enemies. If I didn't know any better, I would say that you are afraid of battle. When the princess said this, the wives of the sultan glared at her viciously. They were aware of the way she pampered her little brother and were also jealous of her natural beauty. Despite their skimpy attire resembling that of a belly dancer, they still could not captivate a man's interest while Yasmin was in the room. Sensing their hostility, Yasmin smiled cruelly beneath her veil before shooing the pesky vixens away. If you don't mind, I have some proper business to discuss with my little brother. Though Hassan's wives continued to glare at her, Hassan ultimately sighed before dismissing his women. Go, as Yasmin has said, we have a business to discuss. With this said, the two wives begrudgingly left the room. It was only after Yasmin made sure the two women were out of earshot, that she further began to condemn Hassan's actions. Honestly, little brother, I know there are no women at the front lines, but as Sultan, it is your job to inspire your troops on the field of battle, even if you do not directly participate. I can hardly think of a monarch who actually stands toe-to-toe with his soldiers on the front lines. If word gets out that you retreated from the war effort so that you could bask in the arms of your wives, what will your soldiers think of you? Would they consider you a sultan worth dying for? As Hassan heard these harsh words, his expression sank. After doing so, he stretched out his body on the couch and yawned in exhaustion. I'm just not fit for warfare. I nearly died in the last battle I fought. I almost had my head taken off by one of my cannons. I've decided to leave war to the men best suited for it. Besides, with the Austrians' support, there's no way we can lose this war. Seeing Hassan's relaxed composure, Yasmin sighed before sitting down next to him, stroking his dark hair, which matched her own as she pampered the young sultan like he were a mere child. As she did so, she offered words of wisdom. I only criticize you because I care about you. You rely on your allies too much and not enough on your own power. What if the Austrians have ill intentions towards our emirate? After all, they are Christian, and though they may be reformists, that does not mean the centuries of hatred between our people can be eroded so easily. Despite her warning, Hassan did not seem concerned. Instead, he shifted his attention and gazed into his sister's gorgeous amber eyes with a look of affection on his face. That won't happen. I know that Berengar intends to use us as a means to stall the Catholic Church, but we need him if we wish to survive this turbulent era. So I have decided, the next time I see him, I will do my best to convince him to take your hand in marriage and cement this fragile alliance of ours for the foreseeable future. The moment Yasmin heard her brother's plans for her, she withdrew her hand in shock and looked the other way as she struggled to come up with the words to convince him otherwise. Hassan, however, before she could finish those words, Hassan raised his hand to silence her before speaking over her thoughts. Yas, you just turned 26 in June. You are well past the age of marriage. If you do not get married soon, you will never have a husband or a family. The only reason you aren't married already is because our father doted on you too much and was never able to find a man he approved of for his precious little daughter. The Granadan princess continued to stare away as she lightly murmured the words. What if he says no? In response to this, Hassan grabbed a hold of Yasmin's veiled face and dragged it over into his sightline as he responded with a severe expression. I will not allow him to say no. He's already discussed the desire to have multiple wives, and if he doesn't respect our alliance enough to take my beautiful sister as his bride, then he can consider it over. Obviously, I won't pressure him so seriously at first. The next time I see him, I will float the idea and judge his general reaction. Then I'll continue to pester him until he says yes." Yasmin began to sigh heavily upon hearing this before shaking her head, which was still grasped by Hassan's firm hand. "Dearest brother, you have actually thought something through for once in your life." Hassan feigned offense as he pulled his hand back and began to criticize his elder sister's choice of words. "What do you mean for once in my life? I think things through all the time." With that said, Yasmin began to giggle before she grabbed a hold of Hassan's head and stuffed it into her bosom while stroking his hair while speaking to him in a condescending tone. "Of course you do." Being treated like a child once more, Hassan began to pout. No matter how old he grew, his sister would continue to treat him in such a manner. Thus he sighed heavily as he enjoyed the embrace. After a while, Yasmin released him before approaching the exit. As she did so, the gorgeous princess called out to her little brother once more with a stern gaze hidden beneath her veil. "You would do well to remember that you are the Sultan of Granada and that your soldiers need you." With those words spoken, the beautiful Granadan princess departed from the room, leaving the young sultan to himself as he grinned with a smug expression on his face. Afterward, he picked up the bottle of wine that he had obtained from trade with Austria and began to pour its contents into a crystal glass, where he swirled the red liquid around before taking a sip from it. After doing so, he exhaled deeply before he thought aloud, "I wonder how Berengar will react when he sees my beautiful sister for the first time." Chapter 316 Battle of the Andalusian Plains. Since the victory and seizure of the province known as Murcia, the Granadans have been busy defending their borders from the Iberian Union's attacks. They were not as well prepared for a full-scale invasion of Iberia as they thought they were. The first few battles they fought showed a severe lack of discipline in their ranks compared to Berengar's troops. The reason for this was simple: the Austrian military attaché had not drilled the Granadans as hard as they would their own troops, nor did they put them through specialized training. As such, after Hassan had returned to Granada to engage in hedonistic activity, the Royal Granadan army was left in the hands of General Ziad ibn Yas, who was far more competent on military matters than the young sultan. This general was a middle-aged man and was currently engaged in a conversation with General Arnulf of the Royal Austrian Army. It had been roughly a year since he last saw his home in Kufstein, and despite this, he was not weary in the slightest. At the moment, the two generals were conversing with each other as they rode their horses next to each other in the middle of the formation, under the protection of thousands of Granadan troops. "So Hassan abandons his army so that he can go engorge himself in women and wine? Leaving us to look after his army, that has got to sting a little, does it not? My dear friend." In response to this, General Ziad merely laughed before responding to Arnulf's jest. "Certainly not. I am actually glad that the Sultan has left the war effort in my hands. Don't get me wrong, he is a decent administrator, but a wet blanket would make a better commander in terms of strategy and warfare. The Sultan is liable to get himself killed out here. It is better for him to be the face of the recruitment efforts back home than to be the man leading the charge." Before Arnulf could respond to this statement, he noticed a rider in the distance. This man wore the standard mirror pattern and mail armor that most of the Granadan troops were equipped with. As such, he was allowed to pass into the army, where he immediately strode up to the command. "Permission to speak, sir." Judging by the frantic expression on the soldier's face, Ziad knew the news must be urgent. As such, he nodded his head in silence, bracing himself for the information he suspected would ruin his mood. "There's an enemy army numbering roughly 20,000 heading in this direction. They are approximately 10 miles out." As soon as he heard this, Ziad began to give his orders to the troops in his army. "Get in formation and prepare for battle. Load your weapons. I do not want you firing your weapons until you see the whites in their eyes." This phrase was how the Austrians had drilled the Granadan troops to utilize their primitive arquebus firearms in the most efficient manner. Whether or not they were capable of maintaining such a high degree of discipline was another story entirely. As such, the Granadan troops, whether they were infantry, artillery, or cavalry, quickly began to load their weapons with the means available to them. After doing so, they began to form ranks and wait for the enemy to arrive. After a few hours, the enemy forces arrived, and when they did, they were shocked to see the Granadan army waiting for them. The Iberian army was comprised mostly of the Crusader order known as the Order of Calatrava, but there were also a few Iberian Union units among their ranks from Castile. These soldiers had become increasingly aware of the advantages and limitations of the Granadan weapons. As such, they instantly began to charge the arquebusiers suicidally, hoping to clash with them before they could reload their guns. While the Iberian troops began to recklessly charge at the Granadan forces, the Granadan artillery began to fire their grapeshot at the enemy lines via their falconet cannons. Numerous projectiles filled the air and blasted into the enemy ranks, causing massive casualties on the Iberian forces. Whether it was faith in God or fearlessness in death, the Iberians were not deterred. Instead, they madly charged into the line of fire without any regard for their safety. When Arnulf saw this, he became quite concerned. The Iberians vastly outnumbered the Granadan troops, and the Granadan weapons required a far longer duration of time to reload than the weapons of the Royal Austrian army. As the enemy line began closing in, several Granadan arquebusiers started to fire their weapons in trepidation, which caused a chain reaction from the soldiers as others instantly opened fire despite not hearing an order to do so. Though some of these shots found their marks, piercing through the enemy's armor and into their flesh, most of them utterly failed to do so. This action forced Ziad to shout his orders at his troops, which were relayed across the army by the other officers and NCOs. Hold your fire. Hold your fucking fire. Despite these orders, more rounds fired off until a point where roughly half of the soldiers still had loaded weapons, forcing them into a dangerous position. While the other half began reloading their guns as fast as they could, the Iberian troops had finally reached the front lines of the army. In doing so, they rushed straight into a volley unleashed by the half of the soldiers who had contained their shot. While this volley was effective in devastating the enemy lines, it did not have nearly as significant an effect as possible. As such, the pikemen took their place and began to battle with the enemy. However, as the battle waged on, the Granadan army started to suffer losses. There were too many Iberians for their army to handle effectively. It would be another story if the soldiers had maintained the proper discipline and fired when they were commanded. However, the reality was a different story, and roughly 5,000 arquebusiers had missed their targets during the initial chaos of the battle. Before long, the pikemen could no longer contain the Iberian infantry, and they began to break ranks and flee the battlefield. Cutting down the Moorish soldiers with fanatical hatred, the Catholic forces began screaming in their native tongue a series of battle cries that sent chills down the Granadan army's spines. Death to all Moors! God wills it! Granada must burn! Before long, the Granadan lines began to crumble, and the soldiers started to rout. Though General Ziad attempted to rally his forces behind him, the effort was in vain. Arnulf grabbed the man by the shoulder and gazed into his dark eyes with a stern expression. The battle is lost. Give the order to retreat, or we will die here. Ziad clenched his teeth and fists in fury as he witnessed his army break ranks and flee the battlefield. However, there was nothing to do about it now. As such, he followed Arnulf's advice. Retreat. All units fall back. As the few remaining Granadan soldiers heard this, they slung their arquebuses over their shoulders and began to retreat from the advancing army. On the other side of the battlefield, the Calatrava commander was eager to pursue the enemy and give them no quarter. As he was just about to give the command to annihilate the enemy, he felt a firm hand grip the armor on his shoulder. As such, the man turned around to see the true mastermind behind this attack. It was a duke under the employ of the King of Castile. The man glared at the Crusader commander before shaking his head. Let them go. When the Crusader heard these words, he was outraged and immediately protested. But your grace, if we do not pursue them, they will regroup and become an even greater threat to our existence. However, the duke remained unconvinced and simply gazed toward the direction that all of the Granadan soldiers were fleeing. If we pursue them, we may be walking into a trap. I would rather have them regroup and crush them again than march my men to a meaningless death. You should be thankful. Without my advice, this victory would not have been possible. After saying this, the duke released his grip over the Crusader and strode his horse forward, commanding all Iberian soldiers to stop. Halt! We shall go no further. Scavenge the enemy's weapons. We shall bring some of these back to Castile so that we may figure out how they function. As for the rest, arm yourselves with them, and become acquainted in their use. The Granadans no longer have an authority on advanced armaments. With these words said, the Catholic Iberian soldiers began to cheer. They had accomplished a great victory here on this day, and with it, acquired the means to reverse engineer the arquebus. Perhaps such a thing would turn the tides of war in their favor. After all, the resurrection of Al-Andalus was something the Catholics could not allow to take place. Chapter 317 Arming Brigands. Months had passed since Operation Thunder proved to be an initial success. The Hussites had advanced well into Loyalist territory during this time. So much so that the Catholic armies were now on the back foot. As a result of this, civil disobedience began to break out all over the realm, which quickly turned to riots. The result of this was a spike in crime. Bands of brigands had begun to appear all over Bohemia, acting as a scourge upon the local populace. While Eckhard was busy acting as the chief military advisor to the various Hussite sects, agents of the Austrian crown had begun to supply various brigand groups with the weapons they needed to cause even greater chaos. The shipment of arms had come straight from Vienna and passed through Eckhard's area of operations. As such, he tasked one of the field agents embedded with his unit to take charge of the delivery. At the moment, this agent was standing in front of the leader of one of the most fearsome brigand gangs within the borders of Prague. The Hussites would soon be marching on this territory. With this in mind, Eckhard devised a plan that involved the brigands' armament, with the intent to distract the loyalist forces. The agent dispatched to supply these criminals was currently standing in a forest outside of a village that lies within the boundaries of the city of Prague. The man in front of the agent went by the name Radovan Donal. He was a particularly rowdy individual who was a convicted criminal willing to use violence to achieve his goals. As such, he and his gang of brigands were ideal candidates to arm with hand cannons. With this in mind, the agent and his fellow operatives dressed like lowly Bohemian peasants entered into the back of their wagon before pulling out a few wooden crates. After using a crowbar to pry them open, the primitive hand cannons revealed themselves. The agent, whose identity was shrouded by a hood, pulled the firearms out from the container and handed them over to Radovan and his men. As he did so, he spoke in a perfect Bohemian accent. "These are the standard hand cannons that have been retrieved from defeated Hussites. You load the gunpowder through the barrel, followed by the projectile, where you then pack it down with a stick. After doing so, you put a bit of powder in the pan, where you ignite it with a slow-burning match." Quote, as the agent was saying this, he was demonstrating the use of the weapon. After reaching the end of the loading process that took roughly a minute, a loud echo resounded in the forest as the gun discharged its projectile, which embedded itself into a large tree approximately 3 meters away. After successfully testing the weapon, the other agents went back into the wagon and pulled out several more crates filled with hand cannons, as well as a few casks. Some were filled with gunpowder, others were filled with projectiles such as iron balls. Having witnessed the destructive nature of the weapon, and the relatively simple loading process, a wide grin appeared on Radovan's face. The man was missing several of his teeth, which resulted from the number of bar fights he had been in during his lifetime. The man pulled out a pouch filled with coins minted by the local lord. He prepared to pay a hefty price. "How much do I owe you?" In response to this, the agent merely shook his head before responding. "Consider it a gift from the Bohemian crown. Just promise me that when the Hussite forces move on to Prague, you and your band of thieves will provide one hell of a distraction to those damned heretics." Radovan chuckled slightly as he heard this before reaching out his hand in agreement. "Aye, it will be one hell of an occasion." After saying this, the agent and the brigand captain shook hands. The deal was sealed with this, and the Austrian agents departed from the town. This was just one of the many gangs of criminals and thieves they intended to arm in the upcoming days. As such, they departed from the borders of Prague and journeyed to the next town on their list of objectives. After the Austrians had left, one of the members of Radovan's gang approached him with a worried expression on his face as he asked the question on his mind. "Are we really going to aid the crown? We are all wanted men. Who is to say if they use this as an excuse to round us all up and execute us?" In response to this, Radovan spat on the ground before handing the hand cannon over to the minion who asked such a stupid question. "I promised them I would simply make a distraction against the Hussites. I don't plan to do anything more than that. With these weapons, we will intimidate merchants and townsfolk into giving us whatever we want. I say that's a reasonable price to pay for such destructive power." After hearing this, the brigands who followed Radovan felt a sense of ease. They did not desire to see the Hussites win the war, but they also did not wish for this chaotic era to end so soon. There was profit to be made for cutthroats like themselves during times of war, and the best way to do so was to rob towns, caravans, and refugees. Luckily for them, the Austrians had provided them the means to do so more effectively. Unfortunately for them, they were utterly unaware that agents of the Austrian crown had supplied them. Instead, they believed it was Bohemia who had given them the weapons. Thus, when Bohemia's armies finally captured them, they would be completely and utterly confused as to why they were being executed for acting on behalf of the Bohemian crown. Meanwhile, in the supply wagon that had begun to depart, another agent pulled down her hood to reveal her pretty face. As she did so, she began to question her team leader for the actions they had taken on this day. Why are we providing these weapons to a bunch of thieves and murderers? Has the marshal gone mad? Such actions will surely cause significant harm to the Bohemian people. When the lead field agent heard these questions, he merely snorted in response. There was silence for some time before he revealed his thoughts on the matter. It is no secret that our hand cannons have begun to find their ways into the hands of the Bohemian crown's forces and that of their crusader allies. After all, they have been captured in battle from the corpses of the fallen Hussite soldiers. I don't speak for Marshal Eckhard, but he is likely thinking that by leaking these weapons to criminals, such actions can be blamed on the corruption of the Bohemian crown, which is why we introduced ourselves as their agents. This can be used in propaganda efforts to rally the people against Bohemia and her allies. Such a result would be disastrous. People have already begun to riot in response to the food shortages and the excessive demands of the loyalist factions. When the people hear that corrupt agents of the crown have distributed weapons to brigands for pay, they will take up whatever means they can to outright resist Bohemia and her allies. When this occurs, it will split our enemies' attention from our allies' attacks and force them to fight a two-war front against the Hussites and the Bohemian populace. By the time the war comes to an end, the Bohemian people will welcome Berengar's troops as a means to provide stability to their lives. Upon hearing this, the female agent began to pout. Marshal Eckhard was willing to cause such harm to the people of Bohemia in order to inspire greater chaos within the realm than was already present. It was simply madness in her eyes. However, she was an agent of the Bohemian crown, lifted from the status of a lowly orphan to serve the state. Thus, despite her reservations, she would fulfill her duty to the fullest of her ability. After all, without Berengar and his reforms, she likely would have died long ago. She owed her life to the Austrian crown and would never even think of disobeying Marshal Eckhard because she found his actions immoral. Austria was at war and surrounded by enemies. They did not have the luxury to fight a war in a fair and just manner. The actions of the Austrian agents within Bohemia would ignite a fire in the heart of the Bohemian populace against their king and his allies. Before long, resistance from groups of all different ideologies would spread across the realm, causing an even greater degree of conflict than already seen. This would create the perfect storm for Berengar to usurp power when he finally managed to secure his victory over the empire. Chapter 318 East-West Schism. Deep within the center of Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor sat on his throne with a downcast expression. The man was on the verge of tears, but he could not allow himself to be seen crying as emperor. As such, he steeled his resolve and continued to read the letter in his hands written by his son Decentius. Arethes was dead. According to his second son, the man had died in combat against the Mamluk forces early on in the campaign. Since then, Decentius had been leading the Byzantine troops to victory in North Africa. The news of the death of a man who was more of a brother to Emperor Vitranes than his siblings was a great shock to the man. With the stratego's death, many things became uncertain, especially in regards to their relations to the West. News had spread to Constantinople about Austria's war for independence, which appeared to favor the self-proclaimed king Berengar von Kufstein. The Byzantines had not taken a stance on the conflict. Instead, they stayed utterly neutral. After all, Berengar was the largest supplier of arms and armor to the Byzantine Empire. Though they had begun to have success in replicating the arquebuses, most of their weapons still came from Austria. Meanwhile, relations with the Holy Roman Empire were tenable at best. This was not the only reason for staying neutral in Austria's war for independence. There was a matter of significant debt that the Byzantine crown had towards Austria due to the agreement made about unlimited arms support. Arethes was the mastermind of all dealings with the upstart king in the West. Without him, it would be challenging to maintain the friendly relationship that the Byzantines had with their debtor. If he sent the wrong diplomat to negotiate further, it could spell ruin to the empire's finances. Losing his closest aide and confidant, who was the godfather to his children, was one thing. Yet, the ramifications such an occurrence had was enough to cripple the emperor with anxiety. On top of this, such a tragedy occurred shortly after his daughter's disappearance and presumed death. The only good news that Vitranes had heard within the last year or so was that his son had salvaged the situation and had rapidly begun to reconquer Egypt and Libya. Before long, the entirety of those two regions would fall into the Byzantine Empire's hands, and they would be able to repay the massive debt that had accumulated with Austria. With this in mind, the aging Byzantine emperor sighed heavily. Now that his alliance with France had crumbled, his next best option was an independent Austria. If Arethes was still around, Vitranes was sure the man would advise him to establish friendly ties to the young king. If only Honoria was still alive, Emperor Vitranes might consider betrothing her to the upstart king from Austria to cement an alliance between their two realms. Of course, that was assuming Berengar was willing to break his betrothal to his cousin. Honoria was an imperial princess, and he would not tolerate her being a concubine. Austria had proven itself a military and economic power like no other. Even now the staple currency of international trade had begun to shift to the Austrian thaler, so much so that some merchants who visited the empire had started to accept the Austrian currency as the sole means of coinage for their products. If the Austrians were indeed to become independent and annex the Swiss Confederation as they have proclaimed, the future was bright for the fledgling kingdom. As such, the emperor was at a crossroads. For some time now, there had been significant pressure from the Vatican on the Orthodox Church to support them in their efforts to combat Berengar's alleged heresy. To the point that the Patriarch had been visiting Vitranes daily, insisting on cutting off trade with the self-proclaimed kingdom to the west. As Vitranes was thinking of such matters, the Patriarch of Constantinople appeared before him in his great hall. When Vitranes saw this, he sighed heavily before speaking his thoughts aloud. "Speak of the devil, and he shall appear. Tell me, Petrus, just what have you come to ask of me this time? If it is about cutting ties with Austria, my answer remains the same." When Petrus heard this response, he frowned. The relations between the Vatican and Constantinople were beginning to deteriorate rapidly. The more the emperor stalled on giving him a reply, the worse the situation became. If he did not provide the Vatican with what they wanted soon, a full-scale schism was bound to occur over the issue of the Berengar heresy. With this in mind, the old Patriarch of Constantinople began to address the emperor in a dignified fashion. "Your Majesty, a representative of the Vatican, has arrived, and given us a request if we do not publicly denounce Duke Berengar von Kufstein and his heresy, as well as provide monetary aid to the Vatican for their upcoming crusade against him, then the results will be an outright schism. The Vatican will denounce Your Majesty and me as heretics and condemn us to hell for eternity. We will be forced to do the same in response. There will be no mending this bridge. You must choose a path as Emperor of the Romans. Do we stand with the Vatican as we have for centuries, or do we embrace the German Reformation as a legitimate branch of Christianity?" In response to this, Vitranes tapped his armrest repeatedly as he thought about how best to handle this situation that had presented itself. Ultimately, he could not afford to denounce Berengar. The man held too much debt against him. With his licensing of privateers, Austria could easily cripple the trade of the empire if they reneged on that deal. Just like they had done to the Holy Roman Empire, the might of the Austrian navy was not to be underestimated. Though the combined might of the Catholic world might be enough to bring down Berengar's grand army, it would be years before they could fully mobilize their forces, and by then, Berengar's army may have grown triple in size. It would be capable of holding its own. After careful consideration, Vitranes stood up from his golden throne before responding with a firm tone. "Inform Pope Lucius that the empire stands with King Berengar and the Kingdom of Austria. Tell that fool that under the declaration of the Emperor of Byzantium and the Patriarch of Constantinople, the German Reformation is at this moment considered a legitimate branch of Christianity." When Petrus heard this, he sighed heavily as he rubbed his temples in an attempt to cure his growing headache. While he knew that Austria's wealth and power were multiplying at a rapid rate, openly supporting them, and their so-called German Reformation would undoubtedly mean war with the Western world. Such a thing could prove disastrous. Nevertheless, he was willing to follow Emperor Vitranes's decision on the matter and, as such, bowed before the emperor respectfully. "Yes, Your Majesty, I will relay your words to the Vatican. Hopefully, they won't react too harshly to our decision, but I fear this will create a rift between us that will never be mended." In response to this, Vitranes simply sat down upon his throne once more and rested his face in his hands. As he did so, he made one more comment about how he perceived the future. With the rise of the German Reformation and others like it throughout Europe, the days of papal dominance have come to an end. They are too foolish to realize that their crusade will be the end of Catholic authority as we know it. I do not care for Berengar or his religious beliefs. I am merely choosing the winning side. With that said, the Patriarch of Constantinople was dismissed, and Vitranes was left by his lonesome once more as he began to sulk in depression over the loss of his comrade. "Oh, Arethusa, surely if you were still alive, you would counsel me on such a course of action, would you not?" With Arethusa gone, the emperor's confidence in ruling his empire effectively had crumbled. Without the support of the mighty strategos and his charisma, Vitranes would begin to second-guess his every decision. With the choices made by the Byzantine emperor and his subservient patriarch on this day, the East-West schism had finally occurred. The year 1421 AD in this world would forever mark the divide between the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox churches. The reasons surrounding this schism were entirely the result of Berengar's effects on the timeline. Had he never risen to power and challenged papal authority, the likelihood of such a divide occurring would be slim. Thus proving once more that Berengar's existence in this world had forever changed its course of destiny. What effect this schism would have on Byzantine growth and prosperity had yet to be seen. However, one thing was sure. Such actions were bound to breed conflict between the Rus and their neighbors in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Even Berengar could not predict the rapid changes that would occur in Eastern Europe because of his actions. Chapter 319 Dietger's Intentions. While Berengar invaded Italy and the Swiss Confederation, the ongoing war in Germany had never ceased its activities. Duke Dietger was currently in a dilemma. Over the years, he had compensated for his losses in Austria by fielding peasant levies to make up for the numbers of troops slain during his botched occupation of his southern neighbor. For over 2 years now, the Bavarian Duke had been at war with his northern neighbors and relying on his levies and allied troops to keep the Luxembourgs at bay. To refrain from paying Berengar the reparations he owed the Austrian people, the Duke had sent an envoy saying he would not be able to meet his payments and instead would pay in one lump sum at the end agreed time frame. Dietger had no intentions to pay Berengar, or the Austrian people such an unreasonable amount of money, reparations for actions taken during warfare? Just what kind of stipulation was that? It was simply being unreasonable. Nevertheless, his general had agreed to the terms and entirely withdrew Bavarian troops from Austrian soil in the designated timeframe. By doing this, he had bought Bavaria 5 years of peace with their rapidly expanding southern neighbor. At the moment the Bavarian Duke was sitting in his castle within Munich, surrounded by his ministers. One topic of contention seemed to invoke the ire of everyone present. One of his ministers was practically spitting as he shouted his views on the issue at hand. Berengar cannot be allowed to achieve independence. By claiming himself King of Austria, he declares himself independent of the rightful King of Germany, our liege Duke Dietger. Austria is a vassal of Germany first and foremost, and every duke of the German realm should oppose this. Upon hearing this, another man spoke up in an equally furious state. The Austrians have gotten too full of themselves. What gives them the right to declare themselves as an independent kingdom? I say we establish a temporary truce with the Luxembourgs and march on Austria, showing this upstart king his place in this world. The fact that a lowly baron's son could rise to such a prestigious position is an insult to every prominent nobleman within the German-speaking regions. Having heard this asinine statement, Duke Dietger slammed his fist on his armrest in a fit of fury. As he did so, he gathered the attention of all of his counselors who were present in his great hall. Dietger gazed furiously at those around him as if he were looking at a bunch of idiots. After doing so, he spoke abruptly and loudly as he chastised the minister for his stupidity. Nobody gives Berengar the right to declare himself king, he takes it by force. While we have weakened our armies with years of conflict over a meaningless title with no genuine authority, Berengar has centralized power over his state while expanding his military and economic might. For Christ's sake, our merchants have begun utilizing Austrian currency because it is so pure. In comparison, the money of our realm is given to the individual lords to mint and is debased to such a point that it would take tens of thousands if not hundreds of thousands of our pfennigs to account for one of their thalers. If we were to win this war, and Austria was still subservient to our rule, what kind of joke would I be as the alleged king of Germany? Might is right. Berengar has the power to declare himself king. Hell, the man is winning a war with the empire to establish his ability to do so. Which one of you has the confidence to declare ourselves independent of the emperor in Florence? If any of you think we should align ourselves with the Luxembourgs and march on Austria, you should remove yourselves from this council and put forth your resignation. I do not need the counsel of such fools. This statement was undoubtedly a harsh one. However, it made a valid point, and that was the idea of marching on Austria being absurd. If one wanted to know how well that would turn out, they just needed to turn back the clock 2 years to their last attempt at such a thing. The minister who had proposed such an idea a few minutes before had an ugly expression on his face. However, he remained silent as he stormed out of the room. After his departure, Dietger gazed upon his counsel with an equally vicious stare as he expressed his following thoughts. Does anyone else have any other bright ideas? For some time, there was an awkward silence in the room as the councillors struggled to come up with a suggestion on how to deal with the growing power of Austria as well as the stalemate that had been playing itself out on the front lines of war with the Luxembourgs. After a while, one of the men present began to speak up. He was the marshal of the realm and knew how to resolve the situation with their enemies to the north. What if we used the money we are supposed to pay Berengar to hire mercenaries to fight the Luxembourgs and their allies? At the moment, we are not even pulling our weight in the war effort. If we don't find a solution to our troop problems soon, then our allies will begin to feel pressured and withdraw their support. After saying this, the councillors present began to debate over the credibility of such an idea. First, the initial minister to speak up voiced his concerns over the issue. If Berengar were to find out about the wealth we have been hiding away, and that we spent it on mercenaries, he could see this as a provocation and march his troops into our lands. We would not be able to last the winter if he managed to do such a thing. While he made a valid point, neither Duke Dietger nor the marshal was alarmed about such a possibility. Before they could explain why that was the case, another minister dismissed the man's concerns for them. Berengar is in the middle of a war with His Majesty Balsamo Corsini and his Swiss allies. It will take some time before he is able to march troops into our lands. Even then, his armies will surely be battle-worn from their efforts in those 2 theaters. We don't have to worry about such a possibility. What we do have to worry about is the fact that if we don't find a way to field more troops, our allies will abandon us. Though the minister who had his concerns about angering the Austrians was not entirely convinced, he also could not argue against this point. As such, he kept silent about any further objections he might have. After a bit more discussion, the plan of action was accepted by Duke Dietger, and thus he made a bold declaration. Send forth the word to all of the free companies that I will pay a handsome amount of gold to whoever fights for Bavaria. I want this stalemate to be broken by spring so that we may advance upon northern Germany. After that was said, Duke Dietger dismissed his councillors with only his marshal remaining behind. The 2 men had one severe issue to talk about that Dietger did not want the other councillors to hear. After everyone else was out of each shot, the Duke of Bavaria closed the door behind them, sighing heavily before speaking. If we do not do something about Berengar's rise to power, in less than 3 years, we will be facing an army that we cannot contend with. These mercenaries of yours better win this conflict for the crown of Germany before then, or else we will have neither the troops nor the wealth to contend against Austria. In response to this, the marshal grinned confidently as he assured the Duke of their future success. Not to worry, Your Grace, with the addition of these mercenaries to our armies, I have complete confidence in being able to break this stalemate by spring and marching upon the enemy's capital within 2 years. By then, you can take all of Germany for yourself, and in doing so, raise an army that can contend with Austria. Berengar von Kufstein will pay for humiliating Bavaria. After hearing this, a wicked grin formed on Duke Dietger's face. He could not forgive the young upstart from the south for crushing his armies so thoroughly. There was only one response for such audacity, and that was war. While Berengar fought with the emperor and his forces for independence, the other German duchies began to conspire against him, after all by declaring Austria to be an independent kingdom. Berengar had essentially slapped the rest of the German nobility in the face. For such a thing, war was the only outcome. Little did they know that is exactly what Berengar desired. Chapter 320 Cultural Reforms. Within the heart of the city of Kufstein lies a grand castle which was the home to the von Kufstein family. Inside its cold stone halls, there was a small stage set up, where over 100 patrons had gathered to watch the display. Adela gazed upon the audience from behind the curtains with an overwhelming sense of excitement and anxiety within her beating heart. For years now, Adela had been surprised with every visit to Kufstein. The first time she had entered the region, it was nothing more than a small agricultural town. Yet now, it had grown into a massive city and was expanding with each day. However, despite the city's massive growth, it was lacking in several areas, at least in Adela's honest opinion. Though Berengar had long since begun sponsoring artists, actors, and musicians for the sake of funding some culture within Austria, the capital city of the kingdom was severely lacking in venues for these creative types to display their talent. With this in mind, the 15-year-old girl sat down at the seat, in the center of the stage that had been set up within Castle Kufstein. She had decided that while her fiancé was away fighting a war for her nation's independence, that she would begin the process of advancing culture within the city of Kufstein, hoping for it to spread to Austria as a whole. The crowd gathered before her was filled with over 100 men and women, primarily from among the ranks of the local nobility. They gazed in silence at the beautiful young girl as she began to play a song she had created to express the difficulties surrounding her relationship with the man she loved. In particular, this song revolved around the sorrow she felt while he was away at war, leaving her behind to wait for his safe return. The sad song echoed in the venue's air, filling the noblemen and women with complicated emotions as they listened to the young girl pluck away at the strings of her instrument like an angel who wept from the heavens. While Adela was playing the harp with masterful talent, a pretty young woman stood beside her and sang the lyrics that Adela had written. This woman was a talented singer from the common populace who was among the many musicians Berengar had sponsored during these past few years. Her exquisite alto voice flowed perfectly with Adela's instrumentals as she pronounced each word without fault. Her tone of voice perfectly expressed the lonesome lyrics that Adela had written, filling the audience with the same sense of abandonment that the girl felt every time she thought of Berengar and how far away he was from her embrace. Before long, the song came to an end, and silence prevailed amongst the audience before they broke out in thunderous applause. Several more eager crowd members cheered for the artists who had performed such a beautiful and touching song. After the small concert was over, Adela and the singer began to speak to the gathered crowd. They entertained their guests for some time with graceful smiles before they had all departed, leaving Adela and the singer by themselves gazing upon the stage reluctantly. One could say that this small concert was a resounding success, and neither Adela nor the singer desired to let it go so quickly. Despite this, the two women eventually looked each other in the eyes with a similar sense of excitement. The singer soon approached Adela and hugged her tightly before thanking her. "Thank you for this opportunity. You have no idea how much it means to me. With this, I might finally be able to make a living off of my music and no longer mooch off of your fiancé's generosity." Adela put on a pretty smile as she nodded her head before responding to the woman's praise. "With your talent, that won't be an issue. The problem is that there simply isn't much in terms of venues for musicians such as yourself. I will speak to my father about this and see if we can construct a grand concert hall so that all musicians within Kufstein can make an appropriate living and share their work with the people." After hearing this, the young woman nodded her head and smiled before responding to Adela's claim. "That would be wonderful. If your father doesn't want to approve of it, we can only wait until King Berengar returns. I am certain he will listen to your advice on the matter. Thank you for doing this for us. Though the king has provided living expenses for all of the artists, actors, and musicians within the city, it would be great if we could survive on our own." When Adela heard this, she nodded in silence. She too was a talented musician. However, unlike the ones who Berengar supported, she was a noblewoman of the highest caliber and was destined to marry the King of Austria. As such, she could not make a professional career out of playing her harp. Eventually, the singer noticed the time on the clock and realized that she had to return home. As such, she hugged Adela and expressed her thanks one more time before departing from the venue. "Thanks again. I appreciate the opportunity." After saying this, the young woman left Adela by her lonesome, where the adolescent girl stared once more at the stage with a bitter smile. She hoped one day all major cities in Austria would have a venue for artists to display their talent. With this in mind, the young beauty left the venue and departed towards Berengar's study, where her father was surely hard at work. It would be best to discuss her ideas with the Chancellor of Austria as soon as possible. As such, when she arrived at the door, Adela steeled her resolve before knocking on the door thrice. Immediately after she did so, Adela heard the familiar voice of her father from behind the door, calling out to her. "You may enter." Upon hearing this, Adela opened the door where her father Otto gazed upon her fondly. His little girl had grown up so fast. Just a few years ago, she was merely a small child, but now she was a beautiful young woman. Soon enough, she would be married to Berengar and become the Queen of Austria. With this in mind, he asked Adela for the reason she had intruded upon his work. "What can I help you with, baby girl?" Adela took a deep breath before exhaling, calming the nerves in her heart as she expressed her desire to begin a cultural shift within the Kingdom of Austria to her father, the Chancellor. "I have come to you to make a request, not just on my behalf, but for all of the people of Kufstein. I think it would be best if we began construction on some locations for the artists, actors, and musicians that Berengar has sponsored over the years to display their talent in exchange for compensation. I was considering constructing a series of grand venues, such as a concert hall, a theater, and an art gallery. I think it would be suitable for the people of Kufstein to spend some of their hard-earned money on entertainment and culture. We could even aid the local chefs by having them provide some form of food and drink for the guests, for a small fee, of course." When Otto heard this, he was pretty shocked. He had not even thought of this as a possibility, nor had Berengar expressed his long-term plans for financially supporting the artists, actors, and musicians within Austria. After all, a fair degree of expense was going towards paying these creative types a living wage so that they can continue to develop their skills. Otto thought about it for a few moments before a warm smile broke out on his face. The benefits of such venues were numerous. Not only could it act as a means of entertainment to appease the masses, but it could also be used as a way to spread Austrian propaganda to the people of the nation. On top of these two things, it would create another form of revenue to stimulate the economy. Thus, the Chancellor was entirely on board with his daughter's ideas. As such, Otto nodded his head and agreed to Adela's terms. "That is a splendid idea. I will begin drafting the plans immediately. Tomorrow, I will meet with the architects to discuss the feasibility of building such structures. When Berengar returns from the war, he will be extremely pleased with the results, and more importantly, he will be grateful for your contributions." Adela smiled when she heard this. For too long now, she had done very little to support her man. After all this time, she finally discovered a way to do so. Adela desired to become the face of Austria's cultural reforms and become the architect behind them. With this in mind, she bowed gracefully to her father before departing. "Thank you, father. If there is nothing else to discuss, I will return to my quarters for now." After hearing this, Otto appropriately dismissed his youngest daughter. Afterward, he immediately began to draft up the necessary paperwork to fund the aforementioned cultural exhibits. With the influx of Italian silver and gold transported to the Royal Austrian Treasury, there was no need to worry about the expenses for such things. Chapter 321 Austrian Ghosts. Within the valleys beneath the Italian Alps, the Italian army had begun to resort to unconventional tactics. The Italian commanders had come to recognize that there was no conceivable way to win a field battle with the Royal Austrian Army. As such, they had begun resorting to guerrilla warfare, utilizing skirmishers dressed as peasants, villagers, refugees, and merchants to attack the Royal Austrian Army via ambushes. As a result, Berengar had slowed his march to Milan and instead sent out his Jaegers to hunt down and destroy the Italian guerrillas. These Jaegers were an elite unit of marksmen and skirmishers armed with the 1419 Jaeger rifle, which was based upon the Whitworth rifle from Berniger's previous life. These weapons were capable of engaging targets out to 1,000 yards and, thus far in Berengar's service, acted as snipers hidden behind enemy lines. However, they were more than simple marksmen. Seeing as most of these men came from a hunting background, they were skilled trackers, scouts, and light infantry. The Jaegers were also fully capable of sustaining themselves in the field. As such, the Jaeger Corps were among Berengar's most elite units, and thus he equipped them in such a manner. While initially dressed in green and black Landsknecht-style clothing, this fashion proved to be widely ineffective in the field. As such, Berengar had recently begun experimenting with rudimentary camouflage patterns. Unlike his primary units, which were designed to attack in formations, this specialized unit of skirmishers was intended to blend in with their environments and take out high-profile targets from long range. As such, Berengar had opted for a far more modern approach to their uniforms. Rather than the flashy Landsknecht pattern attire of Austria's regulars, the Jaeger units fielded uniforms that were a mix of World War I and WW2 German uniforms from Berengar's previous life. The base attire was a standard M43 pattern uniform in the color of Feldgrau. These men would wear a splinter camouflage smock over their field jackets and a matching M43 field cap. They were also equipped with a more modern style helmet based upon the M38 Stahlhelm used by German paratroopers in World War II. This Stahlhelm was painted like the breastplate and had a wire net around which contained various forms of fabric to act as faux foliage. These Jaegers wore hardened and quenched high-carbon steel breastplates based upon World War I German trench armor designs. However, they had been modified to make it easier to shoulder a rifle and were lighter weight with improved mobility. These breastplates were hand-painted in earthly colors by the soldiers who wielded them, in a pattern similar to that seen on old German M38 Fallschirmjäger Stahlhelms from World War II in Berengar's previous life. Over these breastplates was a brown leather webbing in the form used by Imperial German soldiers during the Great War within Berengar's past life. The primary difference was that this webgear was made out of dark brown leather, and was designed to carry their quick-loading tubes as well as other tools like bayonets, canteens, and spades. Their boots were also made of the same dark brown leather. When compared to the Renaissance-style uniforms fielded by Berengar's regular troops, these Jaegers were far more modern in appearance and were very hard to spot when adequately concealed. As such, they were the perfect unit to hunt down and destroy the Italian skirmishers. At the moment, a captain of a Jaeger company was crouched within a tree line, observing a group of potentially hostile targets in the distance. This officer was named Andreas Jaeger. Like so many of the men in this elite unit, he was a hunter before being drafted into the Austrian army during Berengar's previous campaigns. For some time now, he had fought among Berengar's forces and was one of the first to be trained into the role of a Jaeger. With ample experience in unconventional warfare, he was the ideal candidate to lead the more veteran Jaegers in the hunt for the Italian guerrillas. While he and his soldiers quietly marched through the Italian Alps, they spotted a trade caravan roughly 500 yards in front of them. Captain Andreas motioned for his troops to hold their position and conceal themselves. As they did so, he pulled out a pair of binoculars from his webbing and began to observe the caravan's movements. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. This alleged merchant caravan was comprised entirely of relatively young men. These men appeared to have weapons within their wagons, such as crossbows, longbows, and rudimentary hand cannons. At the moment, they were gathered around a fire drinking wine and feasting on a fresh game that they had hunted. Andreas placed his binoculars within his webbing before unslinging his rifle. After doing so, he cocked the flintlock action on his weapon, where he began to adjust his iron sights so that they were set to the appropriate distance. While he was doing this, his soldiers took note of his actions and prepared to take their shots. After Andreas lined up his sights upon his target, he gave the order to his nearby troops in a hushed tone. Fire at will. With this said, Andreas squeezed the trigger on his rifle, where the flint struck the pan and ignited the gunpowder contained within, sending the hexagonal projectile down range and into the torso of a man who was barking commands at the rest of the Italian skirmishers. The 1419 Jaeger rifle had a muzzle velocity of roughly 1,200 feet per second, thus breaking the sound barrier. As such, the hexagonal-shaped bullet struck the target before he could even hear the sound of gunfire go off. Shortly after the echo of gunfire was heard in the distance, the Italian soldiers began to panic. This was because the man's torso was blasted apart by the .451 projectile before they could even hear the crack of gunfire. Before long, more thunderous echoes could be heard in the distance, which followed the deaths of their comrades. With this in mind, the Italians broke free from their shock and began to take cover behind their wagons. When Andreas saw this, he motioned for his troops to flank the enemy position. Two smaller groups of Jaegers immediately broke off from the main force and approached both sides of the enemy encampment. One Italian soldier reached into the wagon where he grabbed a hold of a longbow contained within and a quiver of arrows. However, before he could get back behind cover, he was shot through the gut by Andreas, who was hidden in the distance. The man instantly fell to the ground while grasping a hold of his punctured gut. He struggled to hand off the weapon and its ammunition to a nearby soldier as the life faded from his eyes. The Italians were shocked by the recent development. Aside from the muzzle flash and the following smoke plume, they could not make out the slightest semblance of the enemy's figure. At a distance of 500 plus yards, the camouflage pattern uniforms considerably broke up the silhouette of the Austrian Jaegers, who continued to maneuver and fire upon the Italian skirmishers from the tree line on the hills above. Eventually, one of the Italian soldiers managed to get a hold of a bow and randomly fired into the distance near where one of the muzzle flashes went off. However, the Jaeger was far out of range of the primitive weapon and remained utterly unscathed. Instead, such actions brought the fury of the soldier who was targeted, and his next shot penetrated right through the forehead of the Italian soldier who had dared to fire upon his location. Before long, the Austrian Jaegers had flanked the Italian skirmishers on all sides and set up a crossfire where the remaining Italian soldiers were gunned down, like the dregs they were. After it was confirmed that all of the Italian skirmishers dressed as traitors were killed in battle, the Jaegers approached the encampment to search for anything of value, whether that was intelligence or simply supplies. A few Jaegers were put on guard while the remainder ransacked the camp until finally, an exciting find was made by one of the Austrian soldiers. The man who found the piece of parchment quickly brought it over to Andreas, where he laid it out on the ground. This large piece of parchment contained the deployment of all Italian scouts and skirmishers within the region. It was a valuable piece of intelligence. When Andreas saw this, he grabbed a hold of the man's shoulder and grinned emphatically. "Private Muller, you have done well. With this, we know the general locations of our enemies and can quickly ambush them. I want you and your squad to copy down this information and relay it back to the main force." The young soldier quickly saluted Captain Andreas before following his orders. With this piece of information, the Austrian army would have an easy time cleaning up the Italian soldiers who sought to hamper their advance through unconventional warfare. While this company of Jaegers had engaged in an ambush on the enemy skirmishers, others like them were fighting throughout the northern Italian front, advancing upon the Italians while hiding within the terrain like a unit of specters, reaping lives while moving unseen. As soon as the information of the enemy's whereabouts was spread to the other units, a slaughter the likes the Italians had not expected would occur. The invention of camouflage would play an important role in Austria's future success with the many conflicts they would engage in. The Italians would come to refer to the Jaegers by the nickname Fantasmi Austriaci, in other words, Austrian ghosts. Chapter 322 Battle of the Adriatic. While Berengar's Jaeger Corps was in the process of hunting down and eliminating the Italian skirmishers who had embedded themselves along Berengar's path to Milan, Grand Admiral Emmerich had begun the single most decisive naval battle of the Austrian War for Independence. A massive force of several hundred Italian warships had gathered. Their goal was simple: to cause as much damage to the Royal Austrian Navy as possible. Unfortunately for them, the size of the Austrian armada had been growing as the weeks passed by, and the Austrians now had over 80 Berengar-class frigates at their command. Meanwhile, the cities of Venice and Genoa had been devastated to the point where they were incapable of producing new vessels. After the privateers and Austrian fleets had begun sinking the imperial trade convoys, the emperor was left with only one option on the sea, and that was to trigger a large-scale naval battle and hope that God favored him. As such, 80 frigates flying the Austrian flag had gathered in the Adriatic Sea. Across from them was what remained of the imperial navy, a mix of galleys, carracks, and caravels, most of which were armed with less than 5 cannons on board. Grand Admiral Emmerich was at the lead vessel, the SMS Berengar, where he stood upon the bow, gazing at the hostile fleet in the distance through his binoculars. From what he could gather as he observed the enemy vessels, they were loading what few cannons they had with whatever they could arm them with. Emmerich had a smug grin on his face as he gazed at the enemy armada. His executive officer noticed his expression and sighed heavily before asking the question on his mind. "Sir, what are your orders?" In response to this, Emmerich stowed away his binoculars before addressing the executive officer's concerns. "Have the fleet load the guns. We are going to sail in between their fleet and tear them apart." In response to this, the executive officer sighed once more before accepting his orders. "As you command, Admiral." After saying this, he immediately proceeded to inform the fleet of their tasks. It did not take long for the fleet to be fully armed and prepped for battle. As such, they immediately began to sail towards the Imperial Armada. When the Imperial Admiral saw this, he thought that the Austrians must have gone mad. After all, they were sailing right into the trajectory of their cannons. As such, he made a jest to his executive officer as he witnessed the Austrian frigates closing in on them. "It appears the Austrian admiral has lost his mind. Well, I am glad to see that they are making this easy for us." When the executive officer heard this, he began to chuckle before asking the question on his mind. "Your orders, Admiral?" In response to this, a wide grin appeared on the Admiral's face before letting his decision be known to all. "Open fire when they approach. I'd like to see how their ships survive the barrage of our combined might." After saying this, the Imperial fleet prepared themselves for the upcoming battle. Though the Imperial Admiral's mood was relaxed, the same could not be said about his sailors. Many of them had heard rumors about the effectiveness of the Austrian weapons and spent what they viewed to be their last minutes praying to God for salvation. Before long, the Austrian vessels got into range of the Imperial Armada's primitive cannons. When the Imperial Admiral noticed this, he gave the command, "Open fire." Upon hearing this, the gunners lit the first set of guns, where they were quickly fired off at the swiftly approaching frigates. As the few cannons mounted on the galley fired onto the bow of the SMS Berengar, something happened that outright shocked the Imperial Admiral. The bow of the Austrian frigate deflected the cannonball. Due to the thin layer of steel plating covering the hull of the Austrian vessels, they were well defended against basic cannonballs, and as such, it would take more than a few of them to pierce through the hulls of the Berengar-class frigates. When the Admiral saw this, his eyes nearly popped out of their sockets, and he quickly began to panic. After all, he knew their weakness was that they had far fewer guns than the Austrian vessels, and that once the frigates reached their broadside range, they would be completely defenseless. As such, he called out to his sailors to take swift action. "Quickly reload and fire. Fire at will." As such, the hundreds of Imperial ships began to fire their 3-pound cannons at the oncoming vessels. However, the solid balls fired from these primitive bronze cannons were far from enough to inflict severe damage onto the Austrian frigates. The most damage that the frigates had suffered was from a few of these projectiles landing upon their wooden decks and causing minor destruction. Before long, the agile steel-plated ships made their way in between the Imperial vessels, where Emmerich gazed at the enemy admiral with a wicked grin on his face before giving the ultimate command. "All guns fire." The moment this command was driven, all 3,520 explosive shells were launched from their cannons on board the 80 frigates, where they were propelled into the ranks of the hundreds of Imperial vessels. The moment these shells impacted, they exploded, causing massive devastation to the tar-treated wooden ships. Those who weren't immediately blasted into smithereens were quickly engulfed in the resulting flames of the hundreds if not thousands of small explosions. The Imperial Admiral, who was so confident not 30 minutes prior, could only gaze in horror for a brief second before dozens of cannonballs impacted upon his war galley, instantaneously blowing the vessel apart, and he along with it. However, Emmerich was not satisfied with the results, as the enemy armada lay torn asunder and engulfed in flames on the Adriatic Sea. There were still a few partially intact vessels, and as such, he gave an order. "Reload all guns and fire once more." Despite such an action being complete and total overkill, the ships within the fleet soon heard the command and, as such, reloaded their guns. The few sailors who had survived the initial volley gazed in horror to witness the Grim Reaper descend upon them and claim their souls. The moment the second volley was fired onto what few ships remained partially intact, the fiery explosions filled the air and engulfed what remained of the Imperial fleet. Emmerich gazed with a wicked grin on his face as he broke out into mad laughter. With the overwhelming technological advantage of the explosive shells and the 24-pound cannons capable of firing them, his fleet would be utterly unchallenged on the world's oceans for years to come. He was amazed that Berengar could invent such unique naval technology and was glad to be the first Grand Admiral of the Royal Austrian Navy. As such, he turned around to boldly declare their victory over the Empire in this war. "Men, we have done it. In a matter of minutes, we have single-handedly brought down one of the largest powers on the Mediterranean. With the overwhelming advantage of our ships, nobody in this world can challenge our might on the seas. It is a dawn of a new age. The era of Austrian dominance is upon us. You all have witnessed this historical moment with your very eyes. For King and Fatherland." The moment Emmerich said these words, the crew aboard the SMS Berengar shouted at the top of their lungs in response. "For King and Fatherland." The more they repeated this phrase, the more the nearby ships joined in, as the chant began to spread across the whole Austrian fleet like a virus. Tens of thousands of voices could be overheard in the middle of the Adriatic Sea, among the burning wreckage of the Imperial Armada, as they chanted over and over again the words that had become one of several battle cries among Austria's grand military. With this victory, Austria had defeated any armed support the Holy Roman Empire could provide as an escort to their remaining merchant vessels, meaning that privateers and pirates alike were now free to raid the imperial shipping without fear of recourse from the Holy Roman Empire. When news of this victory eventually spread to the other powers of the Mediterranean, it would begin a new naval arms race. The balance of power in the Western world had shifted overnight, and Austria now claimed to be the region's most supreme power. Only by experimentation and construction of new vessels could the other powers hope to contend with the Austrian navy. For now, the Austrian sailors who had taken part in the brief but historic battle decided to sail back to port and celebrate their overwhelming victory. Chapter 323 Advancements in Munitions Technology. Aldo von Passau stared at the substance in his hands with a cautious expression upon his face, almost as if he were afraid that the slightest movement would cause the petri dish in his hands to blow up in his face. The substance contained within the glass was none other than mercury fulminate, an explosive compound most commonly found within munitions such as percussion caps during Berengar's past life. The middle-aged chemist gazed fondly at the substance. After years of experimentation, he and his team had finally created a chemical compound that could be used to enhance Berengar's military might. While Berengar's enemies had begun the lengthy process of reverse engineering matchlock and flintlock weapons captured in warfare, it could be said that Austria had now reached a crucial point in arms development due to the efforts of the Kufstein chemistry department. It had been close to 3 years since the chemist found himself fleeing the Church's wrath into the then Viscounty of Kufstein. As Berengar's borders expanded, so too did the number of alchemists who were forced into Kufstein's labs to learn the science of chemistry. With more chemists appearing among Aldo's ranks, they had begun to experiment in many different directions within the field of chemistry. One of these directions was research into explosive compounds. After years of study, they had finally created mercury fulminate, which Berengar himself was incapable of doing. Though Berengar had a photographic memory filled with many important inventions from his past life, his knowledge of chemistry was basic, to say the least. As such, the young king had left the development of chemical compounds to the men best suited to the task, and that was Aldo von Passau and his department of chemistry. Aldo was quite excited about this new discovery. The mere thought of his newest invention brought a smile like no other to the man's face. His subordinates stared at his curious expression from afar, thinking that the man had gone mad. After a few moments of awkward silence, Aldo von Passau announced the results. "We have finally done it. We have created mercury fulminate. What we need to do now is create as much of this compound as possible so that by the time King Berengar returns from his war for independence, we may surprise him." When the man's subordinates heard this, they immediately began to frown. They were already overworked as it was. Now they had to produce a stockpile of this new compound? It would appear that Aldo wanted to work his men to an early grave. Despite their reservations, they did as they were instructed and began to prepare another batch. It would be well over 12 hours before they were finally afforded any form of rest. While the chemists of Austria were busy mass-producing mercury fulminate, Aldo had brought a sample of the substance with him to a man who was quite renowned within the city of Kufstein. Baronet Ludwig Schmidt had become an exceptionally wealthy man since Berengar's rise to power. Though he was getting on in the years, he continued to work in the industrial sector, overseeing Kufstein's massive industry. Ludwig, at the moment, was preparing his son Jakob to take over his role within the next 5 to 10 years. After all, he planned to retire when he reached an appropriate age and leave his work in the hands of his eldest son, who he knew would serve Berengar faithfully. While he was in his office, with his son, the older man heard a knock on his door. As such, he immediately got out of his chair and walked over to it, where he was surprised to see the head of Berengar's chemistry department standing in his doorway with a vial that was filled with a fine white powder. Immediately Ludwig's cheerful expression began to sink when he saw the dapper older man gazing at him with contempt. The contrast between the two men was quite substantial. Aldo was tall and refined in appearance, with a clean and elegant sense of attire, while Ludwig was short and ragged, dressed in a blacksmith's apron that was covered in filth. Even his skin had oil and soot spread across it. Ludwig gritted his teeth as he asked the question on his mind to the gentleman standing before him. As he spoke, it was not in the friendliest tone of voice. "What are you doing here, Aldo?" Aldo's expression was filled with smugness as he responded to Ludwig's question. "My department has just finished making something incredible. I brought a sample over for you to test." "Be careful, I know it is difficult for a simple man like you to understand, but this is a hazardous explosive compound. When Ludwig heard these words, his natural prejudice towards Aldo immediately flew out the window. Instead, his curiosity had replaced any inner fury that may have been dwelling within him. Ludwig carefully grabbed a hold of the mercury fulminate and gazed upon it with keen interest. He could not help but ask another question of the man who was his bitter rival. "Tell me, Aldo, what exactly do you want me to do with this?" Aldo's arrogant expression never shifted as he spoke to Ludwig as if he were an inferior. "You're the engineer. It is your job to design new weapons for Berengar's forces to use. Figure out how to use this compound most effectively. Make it quick, too. We have no idea how much longer King Berengar's war for independence will last." Ludwig took a deep breath as he calmed himself. He never enjoyed spending time with Aldo. The man acted so high and mighty around him, all because he was born to a much more prestigious position. Aldo was one of the many older men in Austria who still treated the nobility as if they were superior to the common folk in every way. After Ludwig had reached a state of mind where he could deal with Aldo's taunts, he responded to the man's outrageous demands. "I will manage to make something by the time that our king returns from the battlefield, but Aldo, I will need more than just this tiny vial if my experiments are going to be successful. Are you certain that those chemists of yours are up to the task to produce the amount that I will require?" In response, Aldo merely scoffed as he held his head high, with a haughty expression on his lips. "You can rest assured, Ludwig. My chemists will be able to produce more than enough to satisfy your so-called experiments. Just make sure you produce good results with the mercury fulminate that I will be providing you. I want Berengar to come home and see the contributions that my department has made with a proper demonstration." After saying this, Aldo did not wait for a response. He simply departed from the factory with a look of disgust on his face. Though he knew Ludwig had provided much aid to Berengar's rise to power, he could not understand why the king would promote such an uncouth man to any form of nobility. After Aldo had departed, Ludwig sighed heavily before returning to his son, who was sitting patiently observing the conversation. He placed the mercury fulminate in a safe location before commenting on the experience. "That guy is such a pompous ass. Never mind that. Do you have any good ideas on how to use this stuff, boy?" Jakob thought about the matter for some time before he was suddenly reminded of a serious complaint that his father had always mentioned regarding the existing flintlock mechanism. As such, he quickly got to action and searched amidst the piles of papers stacked throughout the office until he found what he was looking for. The young man cleared the table with a wide grin on his face and pointed at the rifle design that Ludwig had been attempting to create for some time now. The purpose behind this rifle was to solve the issues regarding weatherproofing that the flintlock action had by nature and to increase the rate of fire of the average soldier. "Father, the critical component of your rifle design that has been missing was a means to ignite the paper cartridge once it's sealed within the chamber, correct? Well, what if we filled a small metallic cup with the explosive Aldo had given us and encased it within the paper cartridge? I mean, we don't know how this explosive works yet, but with some experimentation, we might be able to make this work." Ludwig was shocked. Until now, he had completely given up on the needle rifle design that he was experimenting with, but what his son had said was entirely feasible. With that in mind, the father and son immediately got to work, as they would begin to revise the blueprints and experiment with the explosive powder. Though the two men had no way of knowing it, they were about to invent an essential piece of military technology that Berengar had been planning for some time now. One that would allow Austria to remain dominant in a world where its enemies had begun to reverse engineer its current weapons. Chapter 324 Surrounded by the Enemy I. Captain Andreas Jaeger rapidly loaded his quick loading tube into his 1419 Jaeger rifle's muzzle. After finishing this task, he affixed his bayonet upon his rifle and prepared for the next wave of attack. He was surrounded and outnumbered while running low on munitions. If something did not change soon, he and his company of elite light infantry would quickly be defeated. Recently, he and his company of Jaegers had been deployed to the front lines to hunt down and destroy the various Italian skirmishers that had popped up on the field of battle. With the superior range and camouflaged equipment, these brave men had led the charge in the ongoing campaign against Austria's enemies within northern Italy. The Jaeger Corps had taken up the role of the Royal Austrian Army's premier light infantry as they advanced beyond their main force and hunted down all potential obstacles on their journey. After discovering the locations of the Italian skirmishers by sheer coincidence, they had begun an extensive campaign to clear the path towards the city of Milan. Unfortunately, the Italians realized their information was leaked after the Jägerkorps several minor skirmishes between the Italian ambushers and the Austrian Jägers. Because of this, the Italians had responded by successfully encircling Andreas' company while forcing them into defending their position within a small village against a couple of thousand Italian soldiers. At the moment, the Austrian Jägers were holed up inside an agricultural village that lies within the vicinity of Milan. During their brief period of respite, they had used their time wisely gathering whatever resources they could find within the town to create a makeshift barricade in an attempt to funnel the Italian soldiers into their line of fire. As Andreas finished loading his Jaeger rifle, he popped his head out from behind cover, aimed down its sights at the charging Italian horde, and fired his projectile straight into the torso of one of the Italian men at arms. The hexagonal bullet pierced through the man's breastplate as if it were made of butter before blowing out his insides. Blood flew into the air. However, Andreas did not enjoy the sight. Instead, he ducked behind cover once more and rapidly began to reload his weapon. While this was going on, all of his men were using a similar strategy. However, in between shots, arrows would rain down upon Andreas and his forces. One of these arrows fell upon Andreas' camouflaged steel helmet, getting stuck within the netting and faux foliage contained within. Luckily for him and his men, their armor was vastly superior to the primitive weapons used by the Italians, and they could easily resist the attacks. With this in mind, Andreas finished loading his rifle before aiming down its sights at the next attacker. The moment he pulled the trigger, the hammer of his action fell, and the flint sparked the gunpowder, propelling the hexagonal bullet downrange and into the torso of the man who was no more than 5 meters away. After doing so, Andreas did not load his rifle and instead prepared himself for the enemy charge. Before long, the soldiers under his command had also prepared their bayonets and thrust them towards the oncoming Italian soldiers, piercing through their mail and gambeson armor and into their vital organs. The Italians were funneled into the gaps between the makeshift barricades, a few men at a time, while facing the bayonets of a dozen or more Austrian. After well over 100 Italian soldiers, the wall began to break apart, and Andreas was forced to retreat. As such, he gave the command to his soldiers while gritting his teeth in defeat. Fall back to the secondary line. With this said, his soldiers who were still standing against the onslaught abandoned the first barricade, where they advanced back towards the second line of defense constructed within the village. As Andreas and his soldiers crossed back to the secondary objective, the defenders behind it opened fire upon the rampaging Italians, where the Austrian Jägers quickly began to reload their rifles and fire a second volley. Andreas seriously wished at this moment that he had a Schmidt gun nearby to help deal with the massive numbers they were fighting against. They were too far ahead of the main army to gain support, and the closest units nearby were other Jaeger companies who were most likely unaware of their ongoing predicament. As his men were firing upon the nearby enemies, he noticed that one of his soldiers was carrying a pouch filled with several grenades. The moment Andreas saw this, he ran over and questioned the man. "Where the hell did you get these?" "We're not grenadier." The soldier was so focused on fighting the battle that he forgot he was carrying grenades with him, as such a wide grin appeared on his face as he took a hold of one of the primitive steel grenades and lit its fuse before tossing it into the Italian mob. As it exploded, the device sent shrapnel in all directions, claiming the lives of the nearby Italian soldiers. When the soldier saw this, he began to cheer before answering Andreas' question. "I had forgotten I had these little bastards. I won them in a card game with some grenadier. I suppose we're just lucky that High Command hasn't begun to crack down on inter-unit gambling yet." As he said this, the soldier began to distribute the grenades to the nearby Austrian Jägers, who lit them and tossed them into the fray, blasting the Italian army apart, causing massive casualties to the enemy forces. After the vanguard of the Italian ranks was utterly decimated by volley fire and the grenades, the remaining Italian soldiers fled from the village and back into the field where their commander was gathered. Andreas sighed in relief. The Austrians had successfully defended against another wave, but how much longer they could hold out was another question entirely. As such, he quickly gave his orders to the men gathered beside him in the village. "Rebuild the front line, attend to the wounded and prepare for the next wave. All we can do is wait and hope for reinforcements to arrive." Though Andreas severely doubted that aid would arrive, this was already the third wave of attack that they had repelled, and there was no sign of reinforcements on the horizon. They had no way to signal back to the main camp, and enemies had surrounded them on all sides. Things were looking grim for the captain and his company of Jaegers. Before long, the Austrian soldiers had refortified their position. There would be no grenades for this next wave, and they had no artillery support. Many of the men were beginning to run low on munitions. As such, they would not easily defend their position. Andreas waited, with his rifle loaded and flintlock action cocked back. Before long, the next wave showed themselves, so he gave his troops the command to open fire. Fire at will. With this said, Andreas squeezed the trigger of his Jaeger rifle and sent the hexagonal bullet down range and into the torso of the enemy soldier. In doing so, the man dropped to the ground, struggling on his last breath. After this volley was fired, Andreas and his soldiers quickly reloaded their rifles before firing another round of shots down range and into the crowd of Italians. While Andreas was preparing his next load, a crossbow bolt flew past him and into the eye socket of the soldier behind him, killing him instantly. Andreas did not have time to lament the soldier's death. Instead, he finished loading his weapon before aiming his rifle and firing another shot at the enemy formation. Bullets were sent downrange, and arrows were returned upon his position, pelting his soldiers with the projectiles. Some died, some were wounded, and others were entirely unscathed by the grace of God. It did not take long for the Italian soldiers to arrive at the barricade, where they struggled to break through. A few men at a time were able to squeeze through the gap where the Austrian Jaegers pierced through their armor's weak points with their triangular bayonets, inflicting death on the men unfortunate enough to break through their defenses. Some of the Austrian Jaegers had resorted to sharpening their spades and began using them as blunt instruments as they cracked the Italian soldiers over their steel helmets, causing concussions and even death to occur among their ranks. The battle was bloody, and both sides suffered losses as the Italians struggled to seize the ground where the Jaegers had occupied. If they could not get rid of these ghosts, their army would suffer throughout this entire war. The thousands of Italians that were present threw everything they had at the Jaegers' makeshift defenses. However, in the end, by sheer force of will, they were repelled once more, falling back to their encampment. The night was beginning to fall upon the land, and with it, the sounds of gunshots and death throes came to a halt. Andreas did not know what the Italians had planned for the next assault, but if things continued as they had until now, defeat was inevitable, and that was something he was unwilling to allow. The Austrian captain would have to come up with an innovative idea if he wanted to defeat the Italians who had encircled the lightly fortified village. Chapter 325. Surrounded by the enemy 2. Night soon descended as the sky was filled with darkness, and the stench of death permeated the small farming village where Andreas and his men had set up their line of defense. They were surrounded by an army of over 1,000 Italian soldiers, and they had less than 100 able-bodied men at their disposal. The Austrian Jaegers were running low on munitions, and most of them were wounded to some degree. One thing was sure: if they remained within this village, it would become their grave. Andreas was having a serious discussion with his two lieutenants as they tried to come up with some plan to survive. One of the men in question had his helmet in one of his hands and his rifle slung over his shoulder. His face was covered in dirt as he presented an idea to the other two officers. "We have only one option. We must launch a night raid and kill as many of their men while they sleep. We do not have enough cartridges left to sustain ourselves against another assault." However, the other officer was against this idea. It was risky and most certainly would result in the deaths of their soldiers. As such, he began to offer his own plan of action. "That will never work. There are too many of them. All that will do is get our soldiers killed. What we need to do is flee under cover of darkness. There's less than 100 of us left. I say we pick up our gear, we build some stretchers, and we get our brothers out of here before we all meet our demise." Immediately the first lieutenant argued against this point. There were too many valuable supplies they would be leaving behind for the enemy to scavenge if they left the field of battle. "You are saying that we abandon the corpses of our brothers? What about the equipment they have, their painted breastplates and helmets, their camouflage uniforms, their Jaeger rifles? If such valuable equipment falls into the Italians' hands, it will be used against us in the future." In response to this, the other officer snickered before commenting on the worst-case scenario. "If we all die here, they will have 120 Jaeger rifles and camouflage uniforms to use against us in the future. Do you want to give the Italians such firepower?" After hearing this, the officer who suggested a night raid gritted his teeth before bowing his head in defeat. A night raid against such a large force would not allow them to achieve victory. If they attempted such a suicidal move, they would be caught before they could kill even 100 of the Italian soldiers. At this moment, a feminine voice revealed itself from the shadows, startling the three officers as they pulled out their weapons. "Might I make a suggestion?" After posing the question, an above-average-looking woman revealed herself from behind a nearby hay bale. Andreas' two officers pointed their weapons in her direction while shouting commands. "Don't move, identify yourself." Seeing the frightened expressions on the officers' faces, the woman sighed heavily before reaching into her bust and pulling out a special badge. "Agent Artke Lentz, Austrian Royal Intelligence. Now can you put down those rifles before you accidentally blow a hole through my torso?" Andreas sighed heavily before motioning his two officers to lower their weapons. After doing so, he asked the question on his mind. What exactly is one of His Majesty's spies doing in an insignificant farming village like this? Artke frowned before responding to Andreas' question in a deflective manner. "I am afraid that is classified. However, what I can tell you is that if you insist on running away, there is no possibility of you making it out alive. You are surrounded, and they are expecting you to make a break for it. I know I would if I was in their position." Upon hearing this, Andreas frowned. He expected it would be a bloody battle if they attempted to escape, but if the enemy were anticipating them to do so, it would only lead to a massacre. As such, he relented and asked Artke what she had on her mind. "What's the plan?" A sadistic smile spread across the female agent's face as she revealed her dastardly plot to defeat the enemy. "It's simple. You have an entire village filled with hostages, release them all, and I will sneak into the Italian camp amid the chaos. In the process I will poison their food and water supply. Tomorrow morning they will all be so sick that they won't be able to resist, and you can sweep into their encampment and kill them all." Andreas thought about it for a few moments before he sighed in defeat. "Very well, we will go with your plan. I will go round up the civilians. When we cut them loose, you will have your opportunity." In response, the girl nodded. Afterward, she was bound up in rope and carried off to where the other civilians were being held. Before long, Andreas' soldiers had gathered the civilians in the middle of the village, where he began to speak to them in an authoritative tone of voice. "Tomorrow morning, the Italians will attack this village, and they will slaughter everyone within it to ensure our deaths. Let it be known that I, Captain Andreas Jaeger, in service of His Majesty King Berengar von Kufstein, am a merciful man. As such, I hereby release you. Go forth to your masters and seek their protection." With that said, the Jaegers walked behind the villagers and cut their bindings. As they did so, the villagers immediately fled from their homes and into the direction of the Italian camp, utterly unaware that there was a spy embedded in their ranks. After they were out of sight, one of Andreas' lieutenants approached him while lighting a hemp cigarette. "Do you think she can succeed?" In response to this, Andreas shrugged his shoulders before responding. "I have no idea, but she is right. Her option is the best hope we have." While the Austrian Jaegers prepared themselves for battle, Artke had successfully infiltrated the Italian camp. The commander of the Italian forces was shocked to see that all of the villagers were still alive and even more surprised to see that the Austrians had cut them loose. This made him wary. He did not know what the Austrian captain had hidden up his sleeve, and as such, he sent a few of his forces to go scout out the village, while the rest of his soldiers sought to prepare accommodations for the villagers who were now embedded within their camp. As for Artke, she had already found her way into the water supply, where she took out a pouch full of white powder. This was the arsenic that Berengar so commonly employed in his assassinations. Her real reason for being in this village was that she had botched an assassination attempt against the Duke of Milan and fled from the nearby city. While she had escaped her pursuers, she soon found herself trapped in the village while the Jaegers fought for their very survival. After spiking the water containers with the poison, she soon made her way to the butcher's tent in the grain storage, where she spread the toxin to the wheat and meat supply. After doing so, she double-checked to see if she had been followed before making her way to where the rest of the refugees were located within the camp, where she began to blend in perfectly. With this, the Austrians had ensured their victory. As such, many hours passed before the sun rose in the sky above. It was only after it was well past 10 in the morning that the Austrian Jaegers advanced into the Italian encampment. While the Jaegers cautiously approached the area, they soon realized that the Italian soldiers and civilians alike were sick to their stomachs, and too feeble even to stand. With this in mind, Andreas smiled before giving his orders to his troops. Kill every soldier you come across, as for the civilians, leave them be." With this said, a slaughter began to unfold within the Italian encampment as men too weak to defend themselves were stabbed to death by the thrusts of the Austrian bayonets. Thousands of men met their end at the hands of the Austrian ghosts that the Italians had just the day before pushed to the brink of death. When the massacre was finished, Artke revealed herself to the Austrian soldiers. They were surprised to see that someone was not affected by the poison which had been inflicted upon the Italian soldiers and civilians. After all, Andreas did not reveal the entire nature of his plan to his troops. The identities of Berengar's agents were a highly regarded secret. As such, Artke did not reveal her information to the whole company and instead saluted to the captain as she made her request. "Captain, I am afraid that I require extraction. My cover has been blown, and I must confess that I have failed in my duties. I have to inform His Majesty of this information as quickly as possible." Though the Austrian soldiers did not know who this woman was, to salute the captain in such a manner and make such a request meant that she was most likely tied to Austrian intelligence. As such, they did not comment on the situation at hand. Instead, they merely allowed their commanding officer to handle it. With her so publicly asking for extraction in front of his men, Andreas had no option but to do so. The agents of Austrian royal intelligence were highly regarded and could control military units if necessary. If he declined her offer, she would simply order him to do so in front of his troops, which would be a significant blow to his prestige. The fact that she had made a request in front of his soldiers was a sign of respect. With this in mind, he nodded his head with a stoic expression before agreeing to her terms. "All right, I will escort you back to the main force. However, we will be taking my route, is that understood?" Artke saw no fault with these conditions, and as such, nodded her head in silence. As she did so, Andreas gave his orders to his troops. "Men, recover the bodies of our fallen brothers and whatever supplies you can gather. I want you all ready to depart by noon. Do I make myself clear?" Without hesitation, the soldiers all cried out in unison, "Yes, sir." With that said, the battle had come to a close, and the Austrians did as they were instructed. While the other Jaeger units continued to battle the Italian skirmishers, Andreas and his men would be extracting the female agent back to the safety of the main host.